3 hours from this moment, the woman who just spoke those cruel words will be on her knees in this very store, begging forgiveness and...
She only came to buy a bolt of cloth. They turned it into a trial.
I need a bolt of blue cloth. The widest you have.
Well, let me see what I've got.
Shameful, truly. A decent man like that, throwing away a good name on...
Heard you took yourself an Apache wife, Calder. Whole county's talking about it. I expect her mother taught her how to know her place, didn't she?
The time has come.
You just spoke my mother's name. With the same mouth that's been lying in front of every witness in this room.
But to understand why one sentence could silence an entire town, let's go back to where it all truly began.
Roan Calder had been riding 3 days without a real night's sleep. Not the kind that counts. Not the kind that lets a man wake up whole. He was 25 years old. He had a ranch north of Tucson, gray pine gone silver with weather, a stable he'd built himself board by board, nail by nail, over 2 winters that had nearly broken him before they finished teaching him something about patience. He had 20 head of cattle waiting on water they did not have. And he had a horse named Reuben, old and solid, who had carried him through worse than this, though not by much. He carried something else too. Something folded small and kept in his shirt pocket, creased soft from 3 years of being taken out and put back, taken out and put back. He didn't touch it now, didn't need to. Some things you carry whether your hand is on them or not. The sun sat straight overhead, no mercy in it. None at all. He was cutting through Apache land because it was shorter. 3 full days shorter. And 3 days mattered when your cattle were dying slow out on cracked pasture. 1 rib showing at a time, water so far off it might as well have been a story somebody'd told to children who didn't know better. He was not brave, understand that first. He was tired. Tired men take the short road, every single time, and he'd never once seen it turn out different for anybody fool enough to try otherwise. His hat sat low, his bandana sat high. Only his eyes showed, half shut, against glare bouncing off red rock, hard enough to make the whole desert look like it was burning slow from the inside out. Because that's the thing about Arizona in September. It doesn't just get hot. It gets personal about it. He'd left Oklahoma 3 years back. Left in the particular way a man leaves when he tells himself it's temporary and knows, somewhere underneath the telling, that it isn't. The last morning, his brother Micah had followed him out to the wagon. Hadn't argued anymore by then. They'd already done the arguing, said things neither of them had fully meant, the kind of words that only become important later, when there's no chance left to take them back and set something better in their place. Micah had stood on the porch step, arms crossed, watching Roan load the last of his gear. "You're really going?" "I already told you I was." Then he'd said it. "Roan, don't go this time, just that." Not angry, almost gentle. The way a man asks something of his brother when he already suspects the answer's going to disappoint him. Roan had gone anyway. 3 weeks later, a letter found him in Tucson, and he'd read it standing at a post office counter, with strangers moving all around him, like nothing in the world had just ended. A land dispute gone the way those things go when one side decides paperwork moves slower than other methods. Micah had been there alone to hold what was theirs. Roan had been 3 weeks west, building something new, telling himself the whole time there was plenty of time later to go back and make things right. There is never as much time later as a man thinks there is. He'd learned that the hard way, the only way some lessons ever get learned. He didn't talk about Oklahoma. Had decided a long while back that not talking was easier than the alternative. Easier didn't mean it worked. Just meant it was quieter about not working. Reuben's ears stayed easy for 2 hours on that canyon trail. Then they stopped being easy. Roan felt it before he heard it. That's how it goes out here. The body knows first. The mind arrives late, dragging behind like a man chasing a train that already left the station without him. He pulled Reuben to a stop. Sat still. Listened. Wind moving over red rock. A hawk somewhere high and pale, circling something Roan couldn't see. And underneath all of it, small and barely there, a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind playing tricks. Not an animal working a trail, a voice. Human. Broken into pieces by something worse than the heat. He swung down before he'd finished deciding to. The canyon walls closed tight on both sides. Cracked earth at the bottom, dry as old pottery left too long in a kiln. Sage clung to the rock in stubborn gray-green clumps that seemed to have given up on everything except staying alive out of sheer contrariness. He found her 40 feet in, pressed into the shadow of a boulder, like she was trying to become stone herself. An older woman. Silver hair loose from a braid gone wild. Her dress showed fine, careful stitching, the kind a woman makes when she still has some pride left to spend on beauty even out here, even now, even half dead from the heat. Her lips were cracked white. Her eyes were open but not landing on anything real. Roan knelt slow. The way you kneel beside something you're afraid might come apart if you move too fast. Ma'am, his voice came rough. 3 days unused. I've got water. Nothing. He tried again, softer. I know you do, but you need to drink. That's all this is right now. He held the canteen out, didn't push it toward her. Just held it and let her decide. Because whatever she'd been through to end up alone in this canyon, she'd earned the right to decide something for herself. Even something this small. Her eyes climbed up to his face, slow, like coming up out of deep water. Her hand rose, shaking. Took the canteen. He let her drink until she'd had enough. Tore a strip from his bandana, wet it with what was left, pressed it to her forehead, which was hot enough to worry a man with any sense left in him. You wandered off, he said. Not really a question. Just something to fill the space, because out here silence has a habit of turning dangerous if you let it sit too long unattended. She didn't answer. Not yet. He didn't know her name. Didn't know whose people she belonged to, or why a woman her age had been walking canyon country that could kill a person twice over before the sun hit noon. He knew one thing only, clear as the water going down her throat. Leaving her wasn't a thing his hands were going to let him do. He lifted her, carried her toward Reuben. That's when the western sky turned wrong. It came out of the west like a moving wall of earth. Not clouds. A wall. 300 feet of red-brown dust with a hunger in it that Roan felt in his chest before it ever reached him. It swallowed the canyon rim whole, turned the sun into a pale coin behind smoke. He'd seen dust storms. Every man out here had. He had never seen one move like this. Easy, he told Reuben, though it was really himself he was talking to, because the horse's eyes were rolling white and Roan's own heart wasn't doing much better. A shelf of rock jutted out just ahead. Barely 3 feet of overhang. Not shelter, not really, but it was the only word available. So he made it work. He pressed the woman against the stone face, pulled his coat up over both their heads. The storm hit. There's no describing that sound to a person who hasn't lived through one. It screams, like it has a mouth, like the whole desert had finally opened up about something no man could ever set right. The old woman gripped his sleeve with both hands, held on the way you hold the only solid thing left standing in a world gone entirely to wind and roaring dark. He held her back, didn't let go, not once. Not for the full hour it took the sky to remember how to be a sky again. When it passed, everything had changed color. Fresh red dust coated every rock, every leaf, sage, both of them head to foot. The air smelled like the inside of a kiln left burning too long. She looked up at him. Her eyes had cleared. Really cleared this time. She spoke. Apache. Soft. Direct. He couldn't understand a single word. He nodded anyway. Let's get you home, he said. He carried her home riding double, following a thread of smoke rising thin against the darkening sky. Her name. He learned in pieces along the way, in the little English she managed between exhaustion and relief, was Kola. Great aunt to the chief. Had wandered further than she'd meant to, chasing herbs she remembered from a life lived long before this one, before her knees stopped cooperating with her intentions. Foolish, she said at one point, mostly to herself. An old woman chasing plants like she's still 20. Wasn't foolish, Roan said. Just unlucky with the weather. She looked at him a long moment, something considering in her face. You are kind, she said. Or you don't yet know enough about where you're riding to be afraid. He didn't know what to make of that. Filed it away, the way a man files away things he doesn't understand yet, but suspects he might need later. He was thinking about his cattle. He was thinking about the north fence needing mending. He was thinking about how much daylight he'd lost. He was not thinking, not for 1 second, about what waited at the far end of that smoke. He should have been. The camp came alive the moment Reuben carried them in from the east. A shout first, sharp, urgent, a voice that had been holding its breath for hours, and finally let it go all at once. Then people running from every direction, the way a still pond breaks apart when you drop something heavy into the middle of it. Kola was lifted from his arms before Reuben had fully stopped moving. Roan sat holding the reins, alone suddenly in the middle of a camp gone very quiet around him. Women checked Kola over with fast, sure hands. Children gathered at a careful distance, watching him the way you watch something you aren't sure yet is safe to trust. Warriors stood near their own horses, faces set like carved wood, giving nothing away. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody came close. He waited, because what else was there to do? A man doesn't ride into another people's camp and start deciding for them how they ought to feel about his being there. Near the fire where Kola was being tended, two women spoke low to each other, not meaning to be overheard or not caring much either way. Roan caught only pieces, a name repeated twice Talus, and something in the tone that made him lean, without meaning to, a little closer. Too proud for any of them, not pride. You know that isn't pride. Her mother's daughter, through and through. The second woman noticed him listening, went quiet. The first followed her gaze, found Roan's face, and both of them turned back to their work without another word. He didn't know yet what any of it meant, but something about the careful way they'd stopped talking told him it mattered more than he currently understood. A young man broke from the group first. Roan's age, maybe a year or two older, built lean and quick, with the particular stillness of someone who spent a lot of years learning to read a stranger fast and correctly. He stopped a few feet off, studied Roan, the way you'd study a fence post to see if it would hold weight. You're the one who brought her back. Why? Just that. Flat. No heat in it yet, but a question with edges. Because she was dying in a canyon and I had water, Roan said. Didn't seem like there was another answer worth considering. The young man's eyes narrowed slightly. Not hostile exactly. Measuring. The same as everyone else in this camp seemed to be measuring him. I'm Tawan, he said finally. She's my great-aunt too, Roan called her. Tawan looked at him a moment longer. Most men who cut through this land don't stop for anything. Cattle drivers. Prospectors. They ride through like the ground itself owes them passage. I wasn't in a position to be most men today, Roan said. She was crying. I heard her before I saw her. Didn't seem like a thing a person could ride past. Something shifted faint behind Tiwan's eyes. Not trust yet, but maybe the beginning of a willingness to consider it. We'll see, Tawan said, and turned back toward the crowd, leaving Roan no more certain than before, whether he'd passed some test or simply been set aside for later consideration. The crowd shifted, parted, the way water parts around a stone decided it isn't moving for anyone. A man came through. Not tall. Didn't need to be people, stepped back from him without being asked, the way they do for men who earned that kind of room a long time ago and never had to ask for it since. 60 years old, maybe. Face like weathered sandstone carved slow by decades of sun. Eyes sharp and perfectly still, missing nothing. Roan felt himself being read like a page in a book he hadn't written yet. You found her, the man said. English. Careful. Each word laid down like a stone in a wall he'd built with his own hands over a great many years. She was in a canyon. Dust storm caught us both. I didn't know who she was, just knew she needed help. A pause, something weighing behind the still eyes. I am Kesto. Another pause, this one heavier. She is my great-aunt. Roan gave his own name. They shook hands. The way two men shake hands when trust hasn't been decided yet and both know it, and neither's pretending otherwise. Come, Kesto said. We will talk inside. Inside the tent, the air ran cooler. Smoke and old herbs and something underneath Roan couldn't name. Coffee appeared strong, dark, unlike anything he'd tasted. He drank it because refusing seemed like the wrong kind of answer to hand a man who hadn't asked him a question yet. Kesto sat across the small fire, quiet a long time. Roan waited. He'd learned that much in 25 years, at least. Rushing a man's silence rarely gets you anywhere worth going. Then Kesto spoke. The blood of my family was in danger today. Each word deliberate, waited. You brought her back in our way. Not for reward. Not for anything you knew we could give you. His eyes held steady on Roan's face. This is a debt. Our way does not let a debt like this go unanswered. I don't need anything, Chief. Seeing her safe, that's meant enough for me. That is a generous thing to say. Something flickered behind the still eyes, gone before Roan could name it. But our way does not allow generosity to erase a debt. I have something to offer you. Another pause.
This time. This time.
Heavy with something Roan couldn't yet name but was already beginning to dread. I must be honest with you first, however. This is something no man has yet been willing to accept. Roan's stomach pulled tight. He thought of cursed land, deceased stock, strange bargains struck in strange places by men who thought they'd walked away clean and hadn't. I have a daughter, Kesto said. Her name is Talise. He stopped. The tent went very quiet. Even the fire seemed to hold itself still. She is in her early 20s. Strong. Sharp-minded in every way a person can be sharp-minded. Kesto's jaw tightened, just slightly. His eyes moved away for one brief moment, towards something Roan couldn't see, and when they came back they carried a weight that hadn't been there before. No warrior in this camp has agreed to marry her. Roan said nothing. His mind was already running fast through every explanation it could reach. A sickness working slow from the inside. A temper that scared men off in time to save themselves. Something wrong that hadn't shown itself yet on the surface, but sat there anyway, waiting, the way rot waits inside good-looking wood until the day the wood finally gives. Whatever it was, it had to be real. Had to be serious. A whole camp of men doesn't turn from a chief's daughter over nothing at all. You may refuse, Kesto said. There is no shame in refusing. Roan looked up. But if you refuse, you leave these lands, and you do not come back, ever. Our honor cannot hold if you remain after saying no to this. These are your customs. I did not choose them. Something moved behind Kesto's eyes, brief and gone. For just a moment, it looked as though he might say more, as though some other name, some other grief, was sitting right behind his teeth, waiting to be let out. He didn't let it out. I only keep them. Yes or no now? Roan thought about his ranch. About 3 added days of bad canyon trail on every trip from here forward if he took the long way round for the rest of his life. About cattle that don't survive an Arizona summer waiting politely on a man's convenience. He thought about sense, what sense looked like from exactly where he sat. He almost asked to see her first. Almost. Then he looked at Kesto's face and understood, plain as anything, that the answer had already settled itself somewhere Roan wasn't standing when the deciding happened. He thought of Micah on the porch. Don't go this time. He thought strange, unbidden, that maybe this was a chance to not walk away from something difficult for once. Small as the thought was, it landed with more weight than it should have. Yes, he said. Kesto called out one word in Apache. 2 women emerged from a tent across the open ground. Between them walked a figure wrapped head to foot in a heavy blanket, red, yellow, deep blue, thick enough to hide anything a person might have to hide. Roan's legs went uncertain beneath him. He steadied himself. Hard. Told his face to stay still, whatever came next. He'd said yes. He was going to honor it. Scar, deformity, something worse he couldn't picture yet. He was going to stand here and take it whole, because a man who says yes and then flinches when the truth arrives isn't a man worth much of anything. One of the women reached up, took the edge of the blanket. Roan breathed in slow. The blanket fell. He blinked again, because he had braced every muscle in his body for something terrible. And what stood before him in that morning light was the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes on in 25 years of living. Black hair, straight and heavy, falling past her waist like something poured rather than grown. High cheekbones cut clean. A firm mouth that gave nothing away. Skin the deep warm color of good earth after rain. No scars, no marks, nothing wrong at all. Roan stood there, mouth slightly open, feeling like a man who'd spent an hour bracing for a bad fall only to find the floor solid the whole time underneath him. A murmur moved through the gathered crowd. Low. Roan couldn't tell if it was surprise on his behalf or something older, something the whole camp had watched play out so many times by now, that his shock was almost its own small entertainment. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark amber, almost brown, catching the light in a way that made a man forget for one full second how breathing was supposed to work. But they didn't look at him the way a woman looks at a stranger she's meeting. They looked at him the way a person looks at a problem. Flat, patient, measuring. Not afraid. Not curious. Just looking, taking him in whole, and finding him, by every sign he could read on her face, entirely unremarkable. Roan had never in his life been so thoroughly seen, and so quickly set aside in the same breath. Talites, Kesto said. Clear and steady, this is Roan Calder. He brought your great-aunt home today. He is your husband now. Talites held Roan's gaze exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Something worked in his chest he didn't have a name for. Not fear. Not quite. closer to the feeling of standing at a cliff's edge you didn't know was there until your boot was already hanging over open air. He wanted to ask why. Wanted to ask what a whole camp of warriors had seen in her that made every last one of them walk the other way. He didn't ask, because the answer was standing right in front of him, and it was going to take him a good long while just to start reading it properly. An old man sat near the edge of the gathering, watching everything with the particular stillness of someone who has already said most of what he means to say in this life, and is content now mostly to watch. His name, Rowan would learn later, was Wessa. He leaned on a walking stick and did not join the others crowding close to see the bride revealed. His eyes stayed on Talise a long moment. Something passed over his weathered face. Not quite sorrow, not quite pride. Something folded between the two that didn't have a clean word in Rowan's language. At one point his lips moved. A name barely above a breath, too quiet for Rowan to catch clearly. Something that started with an N, gone again before he could be sure he'd heard it at all. Kesto, standing nearby, went very still for one heartbeat, then continued as though nothing had been said. Rowan noticed both things. Filed them away without understanding either, the way a man files away the sound of thunder from a storm still too far off to worry about properly. Kola found him that evening, before the camp settled for the night, moving slower than she had riding double on Reuben, but steady enough on her own feet now, color back in her face, the particular resilience of a woman who'd survived worse than one bad afternoon in a canyon. "You look like a man who has been handed something heavier than he expected," she said, settling herself on a rock, near where he stood at the edge of the firelight. That obvious. To an old woman who has watched a great many men receive a great many surprises in her lifetime. Yes. She studied him a moment. "You are frightened." "Some." "Good," Kola said. "A man who isn't frightened by what he doesn't yet understand isn't paying close enough attention." She looked toward the tent where Talise had gone. "She is worth the fright, Calder. Whatever you learn about her in the weeks ahead, however long it takes you to learn it properly, she is worth every bit of the trouble it costs you getting there. You sound certain of that." "I am certain of very little in this world," Kola said, "but I watched that girl grow up. I watched what this camp did to her, piece by careful piece, until she'd made herself so small a person could nearly miss she was standing there at all." She met his eyes, steady despite her age. "You found me in that canyon because you stopped when stopping cost you something. Do the same for her. That is all I ask, and all she will ever need from you, I expect." Rowan turned that over a long moment, the fire popping low between them. "I'll try," he said. "That's honest. Anyway, more than a promise I'm not sure yet I know how to keep." "Trying honestly," Kola said, "slow, is usually enough to start with. The rest tends to follow, for men willing to keep at it." She patted his arm once, the same brief warm gesture he'd come to know from her already, and left him there with the fire and the weight of everything still ahead of him. The ceremony happened at first light the next morning. The sun came up red over the eastern ridge, the whole sky bleeding slow into gold. Kesto stood before them, holding a length of braided leather cord. He wrapped it once around Roan's right wrist, once around Talise's left. He spoke words in Apache Roan couldn't follow, low, formal, carrying the weight of things far older than either person standing there. Somewhere in the middle of it, his voice caught, just slightly. A father's voice, breaking for half a second on words meant to sound unshakable. Then he cut the cord. One clean stroke of the knife, he pressed it into Roan's open palm. "Now you are one," Kesto said quietly. His eyes found Roan's and held. "Take care of her, Calder. She is worth more than you understand yet." There was something underneath those words. Roan heard it even then, even not knowing yet what it meant. Not a father simply settling a debt. Something closer to a man handing off a piece of his own heart to a stranger because he'd run out of other ways to protect it. During the whole ceremony, Talise had not looked at Roan once. Not when the cord went around their wrists. Not when the old words were spoken. Not when the knife cut clean between them. She looked straight ahead, past the ridge, past the morning, past everyone standing there watching two strangers become something else entirely. When it was done, she was already walking toward the horses. She mounted in one motion. No hesitation, no hand on the horn. Just up and settled. The way a person moves when they were born already knowing how. She didn't look back to see if he was following. Roan stood there, holding a short piece of cut leather cord. Looked at it in his open palm a moment. Then he mounted Reuben. Followed her west into the morning. They rode 2 hours without a single word passing between them. The desert doesn't care about a person's silence. It just keeps being the desert red rock, pale scrub, a hawk making slow, lazy circles, somewhere so high up it looked cut out of the sky itself. Roan tried twice. Talise, I'm sorry if this isn't what you wanted. Any part of it. Nothing. Her back stayed straight, her eyes stayed forward. I'll do right by you. That's all I can promise. Nothing. You could look at me now and then. I'm not going to disappear on you. Still nothing. He let it go after that. Told himself there were worse things than a quiet traveling companion. Told himself she'd talk when she was ready. Told himself a lot of things on that long ride, and if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be most days, though not always with much success, he didn't believe half of what he was telling himself. The land rolled on beneath them, mile after red mile, and somewhere around the second hour, Roan noticed something he hadn't before, the way she rode with her eyes moving constantly, never resting long on any one thing, cataloging the ground the way a bookkeeper catalogs figures. He wondered, not for the first time that day, what it had cost her to build a habit like that. What kind of life required a person to always be watching? Then the sky changed, just slightly. A shift over the western ridge a man who hadn't spent a lifetime reading desert weather might have missed entirely. Roan nearly missed it himself. Talise didn't. She pulled her horse up without warning. Was off the animal. Before Roan had even registered, she'd stopped moving. She walked ahead, fast away from the trail toward a dry wash, cutting down through red rock 30 feet below where they stood. She knelt at the wash's edge, pressed her palm flat against the stone. Roan came up behind her, confused, ready to ask what in the world she thought she was doing, kneeling in the dirt like that. What? Quiet. One word, the first real word she'd offered him since the camp. It landed like a slap and he shut his mouth. She tilted her head, listening to something underneath the wind. Then she stood, fast, turned to him with an urgency that hadn't touched her face once, not once since the blanket had fallen off her shoulders that morning. Get the horses. Now. Away from the wash. Talise. He didn't argue. Something in her voice carried a weight that didn't leave room for arguing. And some part of him, some part that had been paying closer attention than he realized, had already decided he trusted her more than he trusted his own eyes. They led both horses up the slope, away from the dry wash, up onto a rise of red stone 200 yards off. They'd barely caught their breath when he heard it. A sound. Distant. Low. Growing. Like the whole earth had started to hum with something it couldn't hold in any longer. The wash filled in front of his eyes. Not slow. Not gentle. A wall of brown water, thick with mud and torn brush, and things Roan couldn't identify from that distance, and didn't especially want to came roaring down that narrow channel like the desert, had been holding its breath 100 years, and finally let it go all at once. It filled the wash bank to bank inside a minute, filled it so fast that if they'd still been standing where they'd been standing. Roan didn't finish that thought. Couldn't. He stood on the rise, heart slamming, against his ribs, watching water where dry rock had been not 5 minutes before, understanding, clear as anything he'd ever understood, that the woman 3 feet away had just saved both their lives, without raising her voice above a whisper. How did you... He stopped, started over. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. There was rain in the mountains. Flat. Simple. Like it should have been obvious to anyone paying proper attention. 2 hours ago, maybe 3. You feel it in the stone before you see it in the water. The rock runs cold under your hand. Different from the heat sitting around it. You felt that. Through solid rock. She didn't answer. Just watched the water churning below, brown and violent, carrying whole sections of brush like they weighed nothing at all. Talise, we wait, she said. An hour, maybe 2, then it drops low enough to cross. She sat on a flat stone, pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, and went still, in a way that seemed almost practiced. Like waiting was a skill she'd built the same careful way she'd built whatever let her read a flood out of clear sky an hour before it existed. Roan sat a few feet off, watched her, thought, because his mind wouldn't stop circling back around to it. What in God's name did an entire camp of grown men see in this woman that made every last one of them decide to walk the other way? They didn't talk while they waited. But it wasn't the same silence as before. That one had felt like a locked door. This one felt more like a door left open a crack. Not inviting him in exactly. Just not fully shut against him either. He watched her from the corner of his eye. The way she sat perfectly still, watching the water without quite watching it, the way a person watches something they've seen 100 times and already knows how it ends. My brother used to say the land talks to people who bother listening to it, he said finally, not sure why he was offering it, only that the silence had opened just enough to let something small through. Never understood what he meant by that. Not really. Not until about 10 minutes ago. Talisa's eyes moved to him, held there a moment. Where is your brother now? It wasn't gentle, the question. It was just direct, the same way everything about her seemed direct. But something in it, maybe the plainness of it, maybe the fact that she'd asked it all loosened something in his chest that had been tight 3 years running. Dead, Roan said. 3 years back. Oklahoma. I wasn't there when it happened. I'd left. Told myself I'd sort things out with him later. She was quiet a moment. There is no later, she said. Only later that people say to themselves so the leaving feels smaller than it is. Roan looked at her. Something about the way she'd said it flat certain, like a fact she'd learned the hard way herself made him wonder, not for the first time, what her own later had cost her. I am sorry, she added. Simple. No more decoration on it than that. But it landed different than every careful condolence he'd received from people back in Tucson, who hadn't known Micah at all, and were only saying what seemed proper to say. Thank you, he said. They didn't say anything else for a while. But the quiet after that felt like a different kind of quiet than the one they'd started the day with. The water dropped enough to cross a little before dusk. Talise waded in first, testing depth with a long branch cut from a mesquite while they'd waited. Roan followed her line exactly, step for step, not because she'd told him to, but because it seemed the only sensible thing a man could do. They made camp that night on the far side, in a shallow hollow out of the wind. He built the fire. She sat across from it, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough that the distance still said something he hadn't yet learned how to read. He offered her the last of the dried meat from his saddlebag. She took it, ate slow, careful, like someone who'd learned somewhere along the way not to waste anything, not even the simple act of eating. Thank you, she said again. 2 words, quiet, and this time they didn't feel forced out of her by manners. They felt like something she'd chosen to give. He almost didn't answer, afraid of breaking whatever small thing had just cracked open between them. You're welcome, he said instead. Simple. Matching her. She looked at the fire. Didn't look at him. But she didn't get up and walk off into the dark either, and out here, under a sky doing that particular full desert thing, where the stars come out in numbers that don't seem entirely reasonable to a person's eyes. That felt like something. Not much, but something. He lay awake a long time that night, back against his saddle, listening to the fire burn down to coals. His mind kept circling the same ground. Around and around, the way it always did on nights he couldn't sleep, which had been most nights since a letter reached him in Tucson 3 years back. He didn't let himself think about the letter fully. Not yet. Some doors a man opens slow, on his own schedule or not at all. He thought instead about Kesto's face when he said his daughter's name, the particular weight sitting behind his voice. Not shame exactly. Something closer to grief carried a long while, folded up small and carried anyway, because there was nowhere safe to set it down. He thought about old Wessa watching Talise with that unreadable expression. Pride folded into something like sorrow, the name he'd almost said out loud. He thought about Talise reading a flood out of solid rock 2 hours before the water ever showed itself to the naked eye. He thought about a whole camp of warriors, every last one of them, looking at a woman who could do something like that save a life, with nothing more than the flat of her hand pressed to cold stone, and deciding, all of them, that this was a thing to run from instead of a thing to be grateful for. That didn't sit right in him. Didn't sit right at all. A man doesn't walk away from strength like that unless the strength itself is what frightens him. Unless he's more afraid of standing next to something better than he is of standing entirely alone. He thought about Kesto's face in that tent, the care taken with each word. The dead is real, he'd said. But there'd been something else moving behind his eyes that Roan hadn't been able to name in the moment, and was only now, lying under more stars than any man had a right to see in one lifetime, beginning to name it all. A father doesn't hand his daughter to a stranger over a debt alone. Not a father who looks at his daughter the way Kesto had looked at his, in that one unguarded second before the blanket dropped. There was something else folded into it. Something Kesto hadn't said outright and hadn't needed to, because the shape of it sat there anyway, quiet at the bottom of every careful word he'd spoken. Roan didn't have all of it yet, wouldn't have all of it for a good while longer, but he had enough of it now to know the question he'd been carrying since the blanket fell. What's wrong with her wasn't the right question at all. He just didn't know yet what the right one was going to turn out to be. They reached the ranch the following evening. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, in layers of color that didn't have proper names in any language Roan knew. The house came into view, first 2 rooms, pine gone gray with weather, a stable with a roof wanting attention, a barn leaning just slightly east but holding, same as it had held every year since he'd raised it. He pulled up outside the gate. "This is home now," he said. Said it the way a man says something he isn't entirely sure of himself. Talise didn't answer right away. She was already studying the property the way she'd studied everything since the blanket came off ice, moving fast and careful over the roofline, the stable door, the corral posts, cataloging it all without a single wasted motion, the way a person reads a page they intend to remember. Then she dismounted, led her horse toward the stable without being told where it was, like she already knew. Like the whole layout of a life she'd never once laid eyes on before was something she could read the same careful way she'd read a flood coming out of clear sky. Roan showed her the house in under 4 minutes. There wasn't much to show. 2 rooms. A kitchen doubling as the main living space. A fireplace built from river stone. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. A sofa against the far wall where he slept most nights. And 1 bedroom holding a better mattress than the sofa had ever offered anybody. "You take the bedroom," he said. "I'll be fine out here. Slept on this sofa plenty of nights already." He kept talking after that, longer than he needed to by a fair margin. Said he had no expectations of her. Said she could take all the time she needed settling in. Said the things a nervous man says when the silence in a room has grown too wide to cross in any other way. Talise walked into the bedroom without looking back at him. Set her travel bag on the floor. Closed the door. Not with anger. Not with any force at all. Just closed it, the way a person closes something they're done addressing for the moment. Roan stood in the kitchen and looked at that closed door a good while. Then he sat down on the sofa and looked at the wall instead. Night came down fast, the way it always does in September. The temperature dropped 20 degrees inside an hour. The house settled and creaked soft in the cooling dark. He lit 1 candle, sat with it burning low on the table. Couldn't sleep. He lay on the sofa and listened to everything around him. Desert insects building their long nightly chorus outside. Horses shifting quiet in the stable he'd built with his own 2 hands. The far-off cry of a coyote working the dark hills somewhere south. His own mind circling the same worn question, over and over, unable to set it down. What was wrong with her? There had to be something. Men don't walk away from a woman like that, healthy and sharp and beautiful past reasonable argument, without a deep and solid reason sitting underneath the walking away. He thought about her eyes on the trail before the flood. The 30 seconds spent with her palm pressed flat to stone, reading water that hadn't arrived yet. He thought about Wes's face, folded around something unreadable. He thought about a whole camp of warriors looking at a woman like this and, every last one of them, choosing distance over what she offered. None of it added up to any explanation he could hold steady in his hands. At some point he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the small photograph living there permanently, creased soft from years of folding and unfolding. A man who looked enough like him to be unmistakably family Broder across the shoulders, laughing at something just off to the left of the camera's eye. Micah. He looked at it a long while in the low candlelight. He thought about the porch. Don't go this time. He thought about the letter at the counter in Tucson. Strangers moving all around him while the whole world quietly ended. He put the photograph away, lay back, looked at the ceiling of his own ranch house, built with his own hands, in the life he'd put together alone out here in Arizona territory, and understood slow, without much comfort in the understanding, that the question he'd been carrying since the blanket fell wasn't the right one at all. He just couldn't see clearly yet what the right one was supposed to be. On the other side of the closed bedroom door, total silence. Outside, a coyote called once from the direction of the dry wash south of the barn. Then the whole night went quiet again. Roan Calder lay in the particular dark of a man, carrying more than he'd meant to carry into any single day, and tried to close his eyes, and couldn't, and tried again. Somewhere past midnight, exhaustion finally won out over the circling in his mind. He slept, badly, but he slept. And in the room beyond the closed door, though he had no way of knowing it yet, a woman who had spent years making herself invisible enough to survive lay awake a good while longer than he did, turning over, in her own careful way, the strange and unfamiliar feeling of having been looked at, however briefly, by a man who hadn't flinched. Morning came the way it always did out here, sudden and complete. No gentle easing into it, just full daylight arriving like it had somewhere else to be. Roan woke to a smell he didn't recognize. Something over the fireplace, herbs and something slow-simmered underneath, foreign to that kitchen and not entirely unwelcome. He sat up, looked at the table. Breakfast was already laid out with more care than he'd ever managed on his own. The coffee sat in his own pot, made exactly the way he took it, black, strong, no sweetening. He hadn't told her how he liked his coffee. He turned that fact over in his mind a good while before he moved. Talise wasn't in the house. He found her out the back window, on her knees in ground that had never grown a single useful thing in all the years he'd owned this place, red stone and packed earth, the kind of dirt that beats a man down before he even starts trying. She was already clearing it, both hands working, movements precise, following some plan only she could read. She had been on this ranch less than 12 hours, hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to him, didn't know the names of a single horse in that stable. And already she was reshaping ground he'd walked past 100 times and never once thought to touch. He poured his coffee, sat down alone, ate what she'd made, and it was good, better than anything he'd managed himself in 3 years of trying. He sat with that a while, looking at the closed back door, and thought, slow, and without any particular comfort in the thinking, that whatever this woman was, whatever had made an entire camp of grown men turn from her, it was not going to be a small thing to understand. But he found, somewhat to his own surprise, sitting there with good coffee going cold in his hand and then the sound of her working steady in the dirt behind the house, that he wasn't in any particular hurry to walk away from finding out. He went outside eventually, found her still on her knees in the cleared ground, working a narrow tool he didn't recognize, movements unhurried and exact the same focused quality she brought to everything, now turned loose on dead earth that had never asked for anything, and never gotten anything either. Morning, he said. She didn't look up. Food was good. Better than anything I've managed myself, and that's not me being polite about it. Nothing. He stood there a moment with his cup in hand. I'll be on the north fence today, if you need anything. Help yourself to whatever's in the house. Still nothing. He nodded to himself, the way a man nods when he's decided not to take a silence personally, even though some part of him wants to, and went to fetch his fence tools. He spent the morning under a hard September sun, resetting posts that had gone soft in the ground over winter, splicing 2 rails that hadn't survived the last hard freeze. Slow work, done alone, the kind that gives a man's mind too much room to wander if he isn't careful. He checked on her twice from a distance. Both times she was exactly where he'd left her, working with the same patient focus, like the sun didn't touch her the way it touched everybody else out here. By noon, she'd cleared twice the ground she'd started with at dawn. By evening, nearly 4 times as much. She'd worked the whole day without what he could call a real break. That evening at dinner, she sat across from him at the table she'd already claimed as her own, without either of them discussing it. She'd made the meal herself again, different from the mornings, but just as careful in the making of it. Some kind of stew, herbs he didn't recognize, giving it a depth his own cooking had never once managed in 3 years of trying. He ate it, said thank you, meant it. She said nothing, looked at her plate. After dinner, she cleared the dishes with quick, efficient movements, the kind that don't waste a single motion, and went to the bedroom and closed the door, same as the night before. Roan sat alone with the last of his coffee, looked at the chair across from him, pushed back in exactly the position it had been before dinner, no real trace left behind of anyone having sat there at all. He thought about what it costs a person to make themselves that invisible. He thought about doing it for years. What a person becomes doing that long enough. He didn't have a full answer yet, but he was starting to understand the question mattered more than the one he'd been carrying since the blanket fell. Mattered a great deal more, in fact, though he still couldn't see the whole shape of it. They rode into the small trading post nearest the ranch 3 days later, low on flour and coffee and salt, the kind of errand that couldn't wait much longer without consequence. Roan noticed the shift the moment they tied up outside the store. Conversation on the porch didn't stop exactly, but it changed shape, dropped low. the particular quiet of people choosing their words with an audience in mind. Inside, the storekeeper served him well enough, same as always. But when Talise stepped up to the counter herself to ask after a bolt of cloth, the man's eyes flicked toward Roan first, as though waiting for permission to acknowledge her directly. "She's asking you a question," Roan said. Quiet but plain. The storekeeper reddened slightly, found the cloth, named a price that Roan was fairly certain ran higher than what he'd have charged anybody else in the county. Outside, an older woman near the porch rail made no effort to lower her voice at all. "Shameful," she said to nobody and everybody at once. "Man like that throwing away a decent name on." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The unfinished shape of it landed just the same. Talise's face didn't change. Not a flicker, not a tightened jaw. Nothing a careless observer would have caught. But Roan, who'd spent weeks now learning to read the small print of her, saw it anyway. The old practiced stillness sliding back into place, quick and complete, a door closing that he'd only just begun to see cracked open. He paid for the supplies, walked out beside her, matching her pace exactly. "You don't have to say anything," she said before he'd found words of his own. "I've heard worse. I will hear worse again. It costs less to simply let it pass." "Doesn't mean it should," Roan said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But should and does are rarely the same animal out here." They rode home in a silence that felt different from their usual quiet, heavier, more deliberate, the kind that comes after a wound gets touched even lightly. Roan spent the ride turning something over, some rough, unfinished thought, about what it must cost a person to walk through a world built to see them as less, day after day, and still rise before the sun to make coffee exactly the way a stranger liked it. He didn't have the words for it yet. But the thought stayed with him a long while after they'd unloaded the supplies, long after the sun had gone down and the house had settled into its usual evening quiet. 2 mornings later, a rider came up the road he didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, maybe 45, sitting his gray mare with the particular easy confidence of a man who'd never once in his life had cause to doubt his welcome anywhere in this county. Roan met him at the gate. "Name's Otis Corwin," the man said, not bothering to dismount right away. "Got the spread 2 miles east. Come to borrow a length of chain if you can spare it." "I expect I can," Roan said. "Give me a minute." He went to the barn to find it. When he came back out, chain in hand, Otis had climbed down and was standing in the yard, and Talise had come around the corner of the house from the garden side, a handful of pulled weeds still in her hand. The two of them saw each other at the same moment. Both went still, just for a second, the way strangers do when a rumor and a real person collide unexpectedly in the same patch of daylight. Otis looked at her a beat too long. The look of a man confirming something he'd already heard secondhand and was now filing away as fact. Talise looked back at him, quick and complete, the same way she looked at everything, then away, back toward the garden, unbothered, or at least unwilling to show otherwise. Roan handed over the chain. "Obliged," Otis said, taking it. Then, not lowering his voice quite as much as the moment called, "Heard you took yourself a wife, Apache. Whole county's talking about it, you understand. That's so. Just saying what I'm hearing." Otis swung back up onto his mare unhurried. No offense meant by it. "None taken," Roan said, in a tone that suggested there might have been some taken after all, just not enough to bother making a thing of it yet. Otis rode out, looked back once before he crested the rise, eyes finding Talise again before they found Roan, and then he was gone. Roan stood at the gate a moment, turned toward the garden. Talise was still there, weeds in hand, face giving away nothing at all. But she'd heard every word of it. He could tell that much even from a distance. He wanted to say something that mattered. Couldn't find the words worth the air they'd cost. She went back to work, without a sound. That evening the meal she made was different again, richer, more careful than anything before it, the kind of cooking that isn't really about food at all. He ate it slow. Didn't try to fill the silence this time. Just let it sit between them, comfortable as it was ever going to get on a night like that one. The next afternoon, Roan found her at the corral fence, watching the herd with the same reading expression she wore over everything, though this time she looked, for once, like a person, facing something she hadn't yet worked out how to solve. Something wrong? That one. She nodded toward a young steer, favoring its right foreleg, hanging back from the rest of the herd. "It isn't eating right. I don't know cattle the way I know horses and people. Never had reason to learn them close." It was, he realized, the first time she'd admitted to not knowing something outright, without folding the admission into silence instead. "Well," he said, "turns out I know a thing or two myself, if you'll let me show you." She looked at him, something like surprise crossing her face, quick and genuine. "I would." He walked her through it slow, how to check a hoof for a stone bruise before assuming worse, how a steer holds its head different when the trouble's in the gut instead of the leg, how to read the herd's own behavior around a sick animal, since cattle know before most men do which of their own needs watching. She listened the way she did everything, full attention, no wasted motion, and asked exactly 2 questions, both sharp enough that he had to think a moment before answering properly. "You're a fast study," he said, once they'd found the stone bruise he'd suspected and worked it loose. "I have had a great deal of practice being a fast study," she said. "It tends to go better for a person than being a slow one." He almost laughed at the dry edge in it. "Fair point. You didn't have to show me that," she said after a moment, something careful in her voice. "You could have simply fixed it yourself and said nothing." "Didn't seem right," Roan said. "You teaching me tracking, and me not teaching you anything back, seemed like the kind of arrangement that ought to run both directions, if it's going to run at all." She considered that a long moment, the way she considered most things that mattered. "Both directions," she repeated, like she was testing the shape of the words. "I don't believe I've had one of those before. Not in a good while." "Well," he said, "you've got one now." She didn't answer that directly, but she stayed at the fence a while longer than the steer's hoof strictly required, and that, Roan was learning, counted for a great deal more than words ever seemed to with her. The days kept their rhythm after that. Not the rhythm he was used to, living something newer, harder to name, like a different tune playing in a room he'd only ever heard one song in before. He kept trying to talk to her, a little every day. Small things. "The cattle look good this morning." A nod sometimes. Nothing at all other times. He didn't push it. Had started to understand, slow as he was, about most things that mattered, that pushing wasn't going to get him anywhere. With a woman who'd spent her whole life learning the opposite of pushing, learning how to fold herself down small enough that nobody had reason to push back. Lying awake one of those nights, listening to the house settle around him, he came back around, the way he kept coming back around, to Kesto's face in that tent. The care in every word. "The debt is real," he'd said, and it was Roan didn't doubt that for a second. But a debt alone doesn't explain everything. A debt alone doesn't explain why a father would hand his daughter, the daughter he so plainly loved, over to a stranger from outside the camp entirely. A white man who'd known nothing of her reputation here, carry none of the fixed expectations that had followed her since she was young enough to first show what she could do. That was the piece Roan hadn't seen clearly until now, lying in the dark with the pieces finally starting to fit. Kesto hadn't just been settling a debt. He'd been finding her a way out. A way out of a camp that had already decided, long before Roan Calder ever rode through on his way to somewhere else, exactly what kind of woman Talise was allowed to be. A father who loved his people and loved his daughter both, and couldn't hold both loves at once without something giving way, had found the only door still open to him and pushed her gently, carefully, toward it. Whatever it had cost Kesto to make that choice. And Roan suspected, remembering the catch in the old man's voice during the ceremony, that it had cost him plenty. He had made it anyway. Roan lay there a long while with that understanding settling over him like dust after a storm. He thought about the question again. What's wrong with her? He thought, finally, with something like clarity arriving late, but arriving all the same, that he'd been asking the wrong question from the very first moment that blanket hit the ground. Nothing was wrong with her. Something had been wrong for a long time with everyone who'd ever looked at her and decided she was too much instead of exactly enough. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with that understanding. Didn't know yet what shape it would take, out here on this land, between two people still learning how to sit in a room together, without the silence turning into something that needed apologizing for. But he knew, lying there, with the coyotes starting up somewhere south of the barn, that he wasn't the same man who'd ridden into that canyon 4 days back, looking for nothing more than a shortcut home. Something had shifted. Quiet. Steady. The way water changes stone over a long stretch of time you don't notice passing until you look up one day and the stone has become something else entirely. He closed his eyes. For the first time since he'd come west, he slept the whole night through. This is a work of fiction inspired by frontier life in the American West of the 1880s. Character names: Tribal customs and events are invented for storytelling purposes and are not intended to represent any specific historical person, community, or documented tradition. 3 weeks in, maybe closer to 4, Roan had stopped counting exactly, which surprised him because he used to count everything. Days since rain. Days since he'd last seen another human face that wasn't his own reflected back at him in a water trough. Days since Oklahoma. Now the days just blurred into each other. Not in a bad way. In the way good work blurs, when a man's hands are busy enough that his mind finally quits circling the same old drain it had worn into itself over 3 long years. Talise rose before the sun, every morning. He never once caught her in the act of waking. She was simply already awake and gone by the time he opened his eyes. Like sleep itself was a contract she'd negotiated a shorter term on than everybody else. Breakfast waited on the table. Coffee made exactly the way he liked it, every single time, though he still hadn't figured out how she knew that the first morning and had never bothered asking since. Some questions you let sit. Some answers you don't need spelled out. The garden kept growing at a rate that didn't seem entirely reasonable. Deep green rose against red dirt that had spent years being nothing but dead weight on his property. He'd tried planting there himself once years back. Got nothing but wasted seed and a sore back for his trouble. He'd asked her about it. Once, how are you getting things to grow back there? She'd looked at him. Just once, quick. My mother, she'd said. 2 words. Then back to work. And he'd learned already not to chase a door that had barely cracked open before it swung shut again on its own schedule. One morning, she found him staring at a patch of disturbed dirt near the north fence, trying and failing to make sense of it. Coyote, she said, not even slowing down as she passed. Yesterday evening. How do you know it wasn't this morning? Because the edges have already dried and crumbled a little in the heat. Fresh tracks hold their shape longer. She stopped. Looked at him properly. Something almost like amusement flickering at the corner of her mouth. You want to learn this. It wasn't a question. Quite. More an observation she was giving him room to confirm or deny. Wouldn't hurt to know a little more than I do, he admitted. So she taught him. Crouched beside him at the edge of the yard, guiding his hand along the depression in the dirt. Depth tells you weight, she said. Spacing tells you speed. This animal wasn't running. Wasn't frightened. Just moving through, unbothered. And if it hadn't running, the stride lengthens. The rear prints land ahead of where the front ones would normally fall. She glanced at him. You're not going to remember all of this the first time. Probably not. Good, she said. Then you'll have reason to ask again. He caught the small joke in it, the rare lightness threaded through her usual bluntness, and found himself grinning before he'd fully decided to. Is that your way of saying you don't mind the company? It's my way of saying I've noticed you're persistent, she said. Whether that's a virtue or a flaw depends entirely on the day. Which is today? She considered him a moment, something warmer than usual in the look. Undecided, she said. Ask me again this evening. One evening, over coffee, he tried a different approach. Tried to make her laugh instead of just talk. You know, he said, I've been trying to figure out for weeks how you get my coffee right every single morning. I never told you how I take it. You told me the first night. You said, and I'm quoting you precisely, I like it black, strong enough to argue with. He blinked. I don't remember saying that. You were half asleep on the sofa, mumbling to yourself. I assumed you were talking to me since there was nobody else in the room to talk to. He stopped, started over. That's a little unsettling, honestly. Which part? The part where I apparently hold conversations in my sleep and don't remember any of it. She almost smiled. He caught the very edge of it before she tucked it away again. You also said the sofa hated you personally, she added. I chose not to ask further. He laughed actual laughter, surprised out of him before he could stop it, and she watched him do it, with an expression he couldn't quite name, not quite amusement. Something closer to cautious interest, like she was memorizing the sound the same careful way she studied everything else, filing it away for later reference. Word started reaching town after that first month. Not loud. Quiet, the way things that are actually true tend to travel, without anybody having to shout about it. The Calder Ranch hadn't had a fence fail since the new wife arrived. The barn roof, leaking since spring, got fixed in a single afternoon, done from the inside, without a ladder, in a way Roan couldn't entirely explain even though he'd watched half of it happen with his own 2 eyes. A woman named Ruth Hazlitt rode out one afternoon, unannounced, on the pretense of returning a borrowed churn that Roan was fairly certain he'd never lent to anybody. She was the wife of a rancher 2 spreads over, sharp-eyed, careful in the way of someone who'd learned to read a situation before committing an opinion to it out loud. "Heard your barn roof got fixed," she said, standing in the yard, eyes moving toward the garden where Talise worked, not quite staring but not quite not staring either. "Heard it got fixed strange. From the inside." "That's about right," Roan said. "Heard a lot of things, actually." Ruth's eyes came back to him, some of it kind, some of it not so kind. "Counties got more opinions than sense sometimes. Most counties do." Ruth almost smiled at that. "I'll say this plain, since plain seems to be your way, Mr. Calder. I don't much care what she is or where she's from. I care whether a neighbor's fence holds and whether a neighbor's word is good. Yours has always been good. That's enough for me." She left the churn, which he genuinely did not recognize, and rode off without asking to meet Talise directly. But Roan noticed, watching her go, that she looked back once toward the garden, and there wasn't unkindness in the look, just curiosity, and maybe something like respect building slow underneath it. Small thing, but out here, small things had a way of becoming the foundation everything else got built on top of, eventually. Ruth came back a week later with an actual invitation this time, no churn required as an excuse. "Harvest dance," she said, standing in the same spot in the yard. "End of the month. Whole county, turns out, more or less. Wouldn't be much of a harvest dance if half the ranchers stayed home sulking about who's dancing with who." "I don't dance," Roan said. "Nobody does. Until the fiddle starts and they've had 1 cup of Ezra Hollis's. Punch too many." Ruth's eyes moved toward the garden, toward Talise, who'd stopped working and was watching the exchange with her usual careful attention. "You're both welcome. Both of you. I mean that plain, same as I meant the rest of it." Talise came over, wiping her hands on her apron, and studied Ruth a long moment with the same measuring look she gave everything new. "You are inviting us," Talise said, "or inviting him, and allowing me to come along." Ruth didn't flinch from the directness of it, which Roan noted with something like relief. "Inviting you both. Equally. If that wasn't clear, I'll say it clearer. Half this county already respects what you've done with this ranch more than they'd ever admit out loud at church. Time they said it to your face instead of just to each other." Something shifted in Talise's expression. Not quite a smile. "But the careful groundwork one gets built on, we will consider it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," Ruth said, and left it there, mounting up without further pressure, which Roan was coming to understand was exactly the right way to handle an invitation to somebody who'd spent her whole life being told what she was allowed to want. They went, in the end. Talise decided it 2 days before, with no more announcement than "I would like to see what a harvest dance is," said, over breakfast, like she was commenting on the weather. The Hazlitt barn had been swept clean and hung with lanterns, and half the county did turn out, same as Ruth had promised ranchers and their wives. A fiddle player working hard enough to earn every cent somebody was surely paying him. A long table sagging under more food than Roan had seen in one place in 3 years. There were stairs, at first. Roan felt them the moment they walked in, the particular weight of a room deciding what to make of something it hadn't fully decided about yet. Talise felt them too. He could tell by the set of her shoulders, the old careful stillness settling back over her like a coat she'd learned to put on fast. But Ruth crossed the room before the stairs had time to settle into anything worse, took Talise by the arm like they were old friends, and introduced her to 3 ranch wives in a row, before anybody had the chance to think better of it. "She fixed my Delia's mare's bad leg last month," Roan heard one of them say, to nobody in particular, loud enough to carry. "Vet from town couldn't do a thing with it. Fixed it in an afternoon." By the second hour, Talise was sitting with a cluster of women near the food table, listening more than talking, same as always, but nodding along. And just once Roan caught her laughing at something, quick and surprised, like the sound had gotten out before she'd decided whether to allow it. He didn't dance, same as he'd promised. But near the end of the evening, when the fiddle slowed into something gentler, Talise found him leaning against the barn wall and held out her hand. "You said you didn't dance," she said. "I don't." "Neither do I," she said. "We could not dance together if you're willing." He took her hand. They didn't do much of anything that could rightly be called dancing, just swayed slow near the edge of the crowd, out of step with the fiddle and not minding it a bit. This was a good idea, he admitted. The dance. Ruth's idea, Talise said. But yes, a good one. The horse changed everything, though. That's where it started. If a man had to point to one single morning and say there, right there, that's where I stopped seeing her as a stranger I owed a debt to, and started seeing her as something else entirely. He had a mare named Briar. 3 years old, half wild, thrown 2 riders that spring alone. Nobody could get near her back left leg without losing a piece of themselves in the attempt. Roan himself had tried and failed twice, and the second time had left him limping for a week and cursing that horse's whole bloodline. 4th morning of that 3rd week, he woke before dawn to a sound from the stable. Wasn't right. Wasn't the usual settling and shifting horses do in their sleep. He pulled his boots on fast. Went out with the lantern burning low, thinking predator, thinking something's got into the corral, thinking 100 bad things in the space of about 6 seconds. What he found instead was Talise, crouched beside Briar's back leg in the lamplight, fingers working slow and careful around the hoof. And Briarwald, unbroken, hoof-shy Briar stood there like a statue, perfectly still, like she'd been waiting her whole life for exactly this, and hadn't known it until it arrived. "How?" Roan said from the doorway, voice quieter than he meant it to come out. Talise didn't look up. "Thorn. Deep. It's been there a while. I tried twice. She near took my arm off both times. You were afraid of her." Talise said it plain, not cruel. Just true the way she said everything. She felt that. Horses feel more than people give them credit for, and you're not afraid of her. Talise looked up then, held his eyes a second. "I decided a long time ago," she said, "that being afraid of something doesn't usually stop it from happening anyway. So there's no use wasting the fear." She pulled the thorn free, held it up in the lamplight small, dark, wickedly thin, the kind that would have worked itself deeper and deeper with every step Briar took, until it found something a horse couldn't recover from. She opened a small pouch at her belt, green paste inside, smelling of pine and something sharper underneath. Applied it, in one smooth motion, wrapped the hoof, stewed. Briar turned her head, pressed her nose against Talise's shoulder, gentle as anything Tal. Cecil let her, just for a moment. Simply allowed it, the way you allow something you've earned but never expect to actually receive. "She trusts you already," Roan said. "Took me 3 years to get half that much out of any horse on this place." "She doesn't trust me," Talise said. "Not yet. She simply decided the pain is gone, and I was the one who took it away. Trust is a different, slower thing. Comes later if it comes at all." "Sounds like you're talking about more than the horse." Talise glanced at him. Didn't answer that directly, but something in her expression told him he hadn't been wrong to notice the echo. She walked past him and out of the stable without another word. He stood there in the lamplight a long while, looked at Briar, calm now, calm in a way she'd never once been calm for him, and thought, either this woman was the most gifted creature he'd ever watched work in his entire life, or this whole desert was doing something strange to his ability to judge anything clearly anymore. He was leaning hard toward the first idea. Had been leaning that way for a while now, if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be, most days. The days kept their rhythm after that. Not the rhythm he was used to, living something newer, harder to name, like a different tune playing in a room he'd only ever heard one songs in before. He tried to talk with her daily, small things. "Cattle look good this morning." Sometimes a nod back. "Need anything from town next week?" Sometimes nothing at all. He bought her thread once, not knowing which kind she wanted, so he bought 3 different spools and set them all on the table without comment, the way a man sets down an offering he's not entirely sure is welcome. She looked at all 3, took one, handed the other 2 back into his open palm without a word. He stood there holding 2 spools of the wrong thread. Didn't feel foolish about it exactly. Felt something closer to hopeful. Because a woman who corrects you instead of just enduring you, that's a woman who's decided on some level that you're worth the correcting. He thought, standing there, we're learning each other's language. He thought, it's going slow. He thought, and this one surprised him a little when it arrived. I don't mind that nearly as much as I expected to. One evening, she taught him a word, unprompted, which surprised him more than the word itself. 2, she said, pointing at the water bucket by the door. 2, he repeated badly. She almost winced. Try again. He tried again. Still badly by the look on her face, but she didn't correct him a 3rd time. Just let it sit, the way you let a first attempt sit, imperfect but not unwelcome. What's the word for horse? She told him. He got that one wrong too. She didn't correct that one either. It became, without either of them quite naming it as such, a small ritual. One word a night, offered rather than demanded, and Rowan found himself looking forward to it the way he used to look forward to almost nothing at all. The call came near midnight, a young Hazlitt hand pounding on the door hard enough to wake half the county, breathless from a hard ride. "Mrs. Hazlitt sent me," he said, chest-heaving. "Mare's foaling wrong. Vet's 2 counties over and won't make it in time. She's asking—" He hesitated, glancing between Rowan and the doorway behind him. "She's asking if your wife would come." Talise was already pulling on her boots before Rowan had finished translating the request in his own head. They rode hard through the dark, the young hand leading, and found the Hazlitt barn lit bright with every lantern the household owned. Ruth herself kneeling in the straw beside a mare in obvious distress, her husband pacing useless circles nearby, the way men do when the thing in front of them requires hands more skilled than their own. Talise was on her knees in the straw within seconds, hands moving fast and sure over the mare's straining flank. "Breech," she said. "Foal's turned wrong. I need to turn it before she tires further." "Can you?" Ruth asked, voice tight. "I can try. I need her held steady, and I need you to trust me not to explain every step while I'm doing it." Ruth nodded, fast, and took hold of the mare's halter with both hands. What followed was the longest 20 minutes Rowan had spent in longer than he could easily recall. Talise's hands working inside the birth canal, with a patience that seemed impossible given the mare's distress, her voice low and steady the whole while, speaking to the animal in a mixture of English and Apache that didn't seem to matter to the mare so much as the tone underneath it. Then, all at once, everything shifted. The foal came free in a rush of motion, and Talise caught it, cleared its airway with quick practiced fingers, and within a minute the small, wet creature was struggling up onto legs that hadn't existed in the world 10 minutes before. Ruth Hazlitt sat back in the straw and wept, unashamed, the particular relief of a woman who'd been braced for the worst outcome and gotten the best one instead. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said, once she'd found her voice again. "You don't need to," Talise said, wiping her hands on a scrap of cloth, calm as though she hadn't just spent 20 minutes with her arm inside a laboring mare. "This is simply the work." "Simply the work," Ruth repeated, shaking her head slow, something like wonder in it. "County's going to hear about this by breakfast, whether either of us wants it to or not." By breakfast it had, and by the following week, 2 more families had ridden out asking, carefully, whether the Calder woman might look at something ailing on their own places. And Talise had gone each time without complaint, and come home each time a little more certain of her welcome in a county that had needed rather longer than it should have to learn what it had, standing right there in front of it the whole while. Kesto and Tewan rode in one afternoon near the start of the 4th week, unannounced, though Rowan was starting to understand that announcement wasn't really how things worked out hereward, simply arrived on its own schedule, the way weather did. Talise met her father at the gate. Something passed between them, quick and wordless, the particular language of people who'd spent a lifetime reading each other's silences, because the words themselves had never come easy. "You look well," Kesto said. His eyes moved over the ranch behind her, the garden, the mended fences, the barn roof that no longer sagged in the middle. Something satisfied moved behind his still eyes. "The land looks well, too." "It required attention," Talise said. "It's had none in years, so I see." Rowan came out to greet them, shook Kesto's hand, then Tewan's, and found Tewan's grip firmer this time, less a test and more an acknowledgement already settled. "Heard about the wolves," Tewan said, without much preamble. "Word travels faster than most people expect, even across territory lines." "Word travels fine," Rowan said. "Wish it traveled a little slower on this particular subject. A man who cuts a latch to loose wolves on another man's herd," Tewan said, "is not a man who's finished testing you. That kind of man tests until he finds where you break, or until he runs out of patience and tries something more direct." "Comforting," Rowan said dryly. Tewan almost smiled. "I didn't say it to comfort you. I said it because you should know it." They sat outside that evening, the 4 of them, around a fire smaller than the ones Rowan had grown used to sitting beside with just Talise. Kesto was quiet a long while, watching the flames, and when he finally spoke it was careful, considered, the way everything he said seemed to be. "There were men like this in my grandfather's time," he said. "Men who wanted land not to live on it, but to own the idea of it. To hold paper that said a thing belonged to them, whether or not they ever set foot on it themselves." He looked at Rowan. They do not stop because you refuse them once. They stop when refusing them costs more than it's worth to keep trying. How did your grandfather deal with men like that? Kesto was quiet a moment longer. Not always well, he admitted. Sometimes there is no clean way to deal with a man who values paper over people. Sometimes the only defense is numbers. Allies. A refusal loud enough and wide enough that one man's greed cannot outweigh it. He looked toward Talise, then back to Roan. You are not alone in this fight, he said, whatever comes. I want that understood between us, same as the debt was understood before it. Roan felt something settle in his chest at that. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than relief. The particular feeling of ground shifting from uncertain to solid beneath a man's feet. One careful stone at a time. I'm obliged, he said. Simple. Meant. Kesto nodded once, like the matter had been properly closed for now, and turned the conversation toward smaller things. The health of the cattle, the state of the garden, whether Briar's hoof had healed clean. Talise answered each question with more ease than Roan had ever heard from her before. The particular ease of a daughter, talking with a father who'd never once, in her whole life, made her feel like less than exactly what she was. Roan watched them together and understood, more clearly than he had before, exactly what Kesto had given up to set her free of that camp, and exactly what it had cost him to do it anyway. Before they left the next morning, Tewan pulled Roan aside near the corral, out of earshot of the others. My sister does not say things she doesn't mean, he said. You've likely noticed that by now. I have. Then know this. She has not once, in the letters my father has managed to send and receive since the wedding, spoken poorly of this place, of you. Tewan's eyes were steady, direct, the same directness Roan had come to recognize in his sister. That is not nothing. You should understand what that is not nothing. Roan absorbed that. I'm trying to. Try harder. Tewan's, though there was no real edge in it, just plain advice offered plain. She has spent her whole life being told, in 100 quiet ways, that she was too much for anyone to want fully. Don't be one more voice adding to that count, even by accident, even by simply not paying close enough attention. He mounted his horse before Roan could answer properly, and rode off after his father without waiting for a response, leaving Roan standing at the corral with a piece of advice that felt less like a warning and more like a door being held open, briefly, for him to walk through if he chose to. The trouble started with the cattle going restless. Not all at once. Built slow over 3-4 evenings. Reuben's ears staying up too long past sundown. The herd bunching tighter than usual near the corral fence, the way cattle bunch when something out there in the dark has convinced them, correctly or not, that safety comes in numbers. The first night, Roan walked the perimeter with a lantern and found nothing. Told himself it was nerves. Cattle get nerves same as people. The second night, the dogs wouldn't settle, paced the porch, growled low at shadows that weren't there, or weren't there that he could see, anyway. The third night, Talise stood at the window a long while after dinner, watching the tree line past the corral, with an expression he'd come to recognize. The reading expression, the one she wore when the land was telling her something the rest of them hadn't learned to hear yet. Something's got them nervous, Roan said. Third night running. Can't say what. She was quiet a moment. Set down the cloth she'd been drying dishes with. Wolves, she said. Close. Closer than they usually come. And closer every night. How do you know that from in here? Because the dogs would be barking outright if it was anything else. They're not barking. They're watching. That's a different kind of fear. She looked toward the window again. And because the cattle have started facing the same direction every evening at almost the same hour. Animals don't do that by accident. He hadn't noticed the pattern in the cattle. He noticed now, and once noticed, couldn't unsee it. We should move them closer to the house, he said. Tighter corral. We should, Talise agreed. But whatever's circling isn't circling because it's hungry in the ordinary way. Hungry animals don't wait 3 nights building courage. Something's testing us first. They moved the herd tighter the next morning. Reinforced the corral gate with a second latch. Roan told himself that would be enough. It wasn't. That night he barely slept, which was fine. Except it wasn't. Not really. Because a man running on no sleep 3 weeks running eventually starts making mistakes, and mistakes out here can cost a person more than they're prepared to pay. He was on the sofa when the first sound came. Not a howl. Something worse than a howl. A low, coordinated, kind of quiet that meant a pack working together instead of one animal working alone. He was on his feet before he'd finished waking up. grabbed his rifle from beside the door. Except his hands weren't cooperating properly yet, fingers still thick with sleep, and he fumbled the latch twice before it gave, which was when he heard the corral gate, which was when he heard the cattle scream. Because that's the sound a cow makes when a wolf's got its teeth into something vital. Nobody who's heard it forgets it. Nobody wants to hear it twice. He ran. The corral was chaos. Full dark except for a sliver of moon, cattle bunched and bawling in one terrifying mass against the far fence, and moving through the middle of that chaos, wolves. 4 of them. Maybe 5. Hard to count in the dark with everything moving at once. Roan raised the rifle, except his hands were shaking too hard for a clean shot, and in this dark, in this chaos, a bad shot was as likely to hit a cow as a wolf. He fired anyway. Once. Grazed something, heard the yelp, sharp and short, but didn't drop it, and the animal peeled off into the dark, still moving under its own power, wounded but not stopped. He didn't get the chance to reload before the rest of it happened, because Talise was already past him, moving fast, low, a rope in one hand, something else glinting in the other that he'd later learn was a skinning knife. She kept somewhere he'd never thought to look. She didn't hesitate at the fence, went over it in one motion, dropped into the middle of that screaming, snarling chaos like she belonged there. Like this was simply the next task, on a list she'd already written out in her head hours ago. Talise, she didn't answer, didn't have time to answer. The nearest wolf turned toward her, and Roan's heart actually stopped. He'd swear to it later, except it started again fast when she didn't run. She threw the rope, caught the animal's front legs mid-stride. Wolf went down hard, rolling, and before it could recover, she was past it, moving toward the next one. Knife flashing once in the thin moonlight. A second wolf lunged. She turned into it instead of away from it, which made no sense to Roan's mind, none at all, until he watched her use the animal's own momentum to throw it sideways into the fence post, where it hit hard and didn't get up fast. A third wolf went for the cattle again. She was there before it reached them, rope snapping out, catching it around the throat, and she hauled back with both hands and her whole body weight and dropped it before it ever got its jaws around anything worth losing. Roan managed to reload by then. Fired a second shot into the air above the fence line, loud, deliberate, the kind of sound meant to break a pack's nerve rather than kill anything. It worked or helped work, because the remaining wolves, 2, maybe 3, he still couldn't get an accurate count with his own heart hammering that loud and his ears broke off. Ran. The way predators run when the thing they thought was prey turns out to be something else entirely, and the noise around it turns out to be more trouble than any single meal is worth. Silence came down over the corral so fast it felt like its own kind of violence. Roan stood at the fence with the rifle still smoking, and understood, watching Talise stand in the middle of that corral, catching her breath with a wolf's blood on the blade in her hand, that he had never once in his entire life seen anything what he'd just witnessed. "You're hurt," he said, because there was blood on her sleeve, though he couldn't tell yet whose it was. "Not mine." She wiped the knife on her thigh, calm as a person cleaning up after supper. "The cattle. Check them." He checked. 2 had cuts, nothing that wouldn't heal. 1 was missing a decent chunk of hide from a shoulder, but would live to complain about it for years. None dead, none dying, which, given what he'd just watched come through that gate, felt like something close to a miracle. They spent the better part of the next day doctoring what needed doctoring. Talise moved between the injured cattle with the same green pace she'd used on Briar's hoof, the same unhurried precision, while Roan held each animal steady and tried, without much success, to match her calm. "You don't get rattled by any of this," he said at one point, watching her work on a gash along a steer's shoulder. "Wolves in the dark, cuts, blood everywhere. None of it seems to touch you." "It touches me," she said, not looking up. "I've simply learned that showing it doesn't help the animal in front of me. There will be time to feel things properly. This isn't that time." "When is that time, exactly?" She considered the question longer than he expected. "Later. Alone, usually. Or not at all some years." She glanced at him, something almost rueful in it. "I'm working on that second part." It was, he realized, about as close as she'd come yet to admitting something vulnerable out loud, wrapped in a joke dry enough that a person could miss it if they weren't paying attention. He was paying attention. "Well," he said, "you've got company now, if you ever decide the time's arrived." She didn't answer that directly, but she didn't look away from him either, and that, he was learning, counted for something significant where words might have counted for less. He climbed over the fence, stood in front of her in the dark, chest still heaving, mind still trying, and failing to catch up with what his eyes had just told it. Where, he said. Stopped. Started again. Where does a person learn to do that? Talise looked at him. Something guarded came down over her face, quick, like a door closing on instinct before she'd even decided to close it. Where I come from, she said, a person learns to do that or a person doesn't survive very long. She turned, walked back toward the house. Roan stood there in the dark corral, surrounded by cattle still trembling but alive, and thought, because the idea wouldn't leave him alone, kept working itself over and over. Now I understand a little better why they were afraid of her, he thought. Except that's not fair. That's not the right way to say it. He thought, they weren't afraid of what she could do to them. They were afraid of standing next to someone who could do it better than they ever would. He thought that was maybe the saddest thing he'd figured out about people in a long while. And he'd figured out plenty of sad things about people over the years. Morning came gray and quiet. Roan walked the corral fence at first light, looking for the way the wolves had gotten in. Because a corral fence that had held all winter didn't just fail on its own, not without a reason attached to it somewhere. He found the gate latch first, broken clean, not chewed through, not worked loose by weather. Cut. He stood there a long moment with that fact sitting heavy in his gut. Because a wolf doesn't cut a latch, a wolf doesn't know what a latch is. Something had opened that gate on purpose, and it hadn't been an animal that did it. Talise came up behind him without a sound, the way she moved through everything. Looked at the cut latch. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't wolves finding an opportunity, she said. This was wolves given one. Baited, fresh blood, meat probably, dragged along a line to bring them close. Then left near the gate to hold them there long enough to do damage. She crouched, studied the ground outside the fence, fingers moving over faint marks Roan wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't pointed them out. Horse tracks. One rider. Came from the east, left the same way. East as Corwin spread. East is also the road to town, she said. And beyond it, further east still, is everything else in this territory. Don't build a wall out of one direction yet. They followed the tracks a half-mile before they gave out on hard rock, which frustrated Roan more than he expected, because he'd wanted an answer, a clean one, something he could point at and be angry with properly. Except what they found instead, near where the trail went cold, was a scrap of burlap sack, still smelling faintly of old blood, and caught in the burlap, small enough that Roan nearly missed it entirely, a badge. Brass, tarnished, the kind a county land office might issue to a surveyor or an agent working under contract. Worn smooth in places from years of handling. He turned it over in his palm, stopped breathing for a second, because stamped across the face of it, faded but still legible if a man knew to look close, was a name. G. Draven, Land Agent, Kiowa County, Oklahoma. Roan stood there with that badge in his hand and felt the whole morning tilt sideways underneath him. Kiowa County, his brother's county, the county where Micah had died defending land that should never have needed defending in the first place, if the paperwork behind it had been honest paperwork, instead of whatever it had actually turned out to be. He remembered the letter word for word, though he'd never once admitted that to anybody. A dispute over a boundary line that had somehow, in the space of a single season, transformed from a matter for a county clerk into a matter for a coroner. The details had stayed vague in every account that ever reached him. Vague enough that Roan had spent 3 years assuming. But vague was simply how these things went. Out on land, nobody official cared enough to police properly. He'd heard the name Draven exactly once before. In that letter, in the careful, terrible language a county clerk trying to explain, without quite explaining, how a dispute over boundary lines had turned into something that left a man dead in his own field. He hadn't let himself say the name out loud since that letter arrived. Hadn't needed to. It had lived quiet in the back of his mind for 3 years, waiting the way certain names wait for the moment they're finally called on to matter again. Roan. Talise's voice, careful. You know this name. I know this name, he said. Voice came out rougher than he meant it to. This is the man my brother died fighting. Or fighting because of, anyway. Never met him face to face, never needed to. His name was enough to ruin everything it touched. Talise looked at the badge in his hand, then at him. And now his name is here, she said. In Arizona territory. Attached to wolves let loose on your cattle in the middle of the night. Seems that way. Which means this was never really about the wolves at all. Her eyes had gone hard, focused, the same look she'd worn reading the flood 2 hours before it arrived. This was a message. Somebody testing what it takes to frighten you off this land. Roan closed his fist around the badge, felt the metal bite into his palm, welcomed the small sting of it, because it was easier to feel that than to feel the larger thing trying to climb up his throat. "Except I'm not going anywhere," he said. Quiet. Certain. "Not this time." Talise held his gaze a long moment. "No," she said, "I don't believe you are." The note came 2 mornings after, tucked under a stone on the porch step where a person couldn't miss it. No rider seen coming or going. Roan unfolded it slow. Block letters, deliberately plain, the kind of handwriting a man uses when he doesn't want it traced back to him by its shape. "Sell while selling is still an option available to you. No signature. Didn't need one." Talise read it over his shoulder, expression unreadable. "He's rattled," she said. "Doesn't feel like rattled." "It is," she said. "A man certain of his own power doesn't need to leave notes under stones. He simply arrives and takes what he wants." She tapped the paper once. "This is a man realizing the wolves didn't work, and hoping the fear does what the wolves couldn't." Roan turned the note over, found nothing more on the back of it. "Doesn't change anything," he said. "No," Talise agreed. "It only confirms what we already knew. He is watching, he is patient, and he is running low on patience faster than he'd like us to believe." Roan folded the note and set it in the same drawer where the badge already sat, another small true thing added to a growing pile of them. He rode into Tucson 3 days later. Told Talise he needed supplies, which was true, but wasn't the whole truth, and she looked at him in a way that suggested she knew it wasn't the whole truth and had decided to let him carry the particular errand alone. He went to the land office first, asked, careful and roundabout, whether anybody by the name of Draven had filed papers or made inquiries anywhere in the territory recently. The clerk, an older man with ink-stained fingers and a memory for names sharper than most, thought about it a moment. "Draven," he said slowly. "Can't say the name's crossed my desk directly, but there's been talk. Land agents coming through, asking about water rights out past the Eastern Range. Fella working under a different name, far as the paperwork shows, but working awful close to where a man named Draven's been known to operate before. Out east. Different name? Happens sometimes. A man burns a reputation bad enough in one territory, he starts working under a partner's name in the next. Keeps his own name clean on paper while his methods stay exactly the same underneath it." Roan absorbed that, felt something settle into place, cold and certain. "You know this partner's name? The one he's working under?" The clerk shook his head. "Not yet. But if papers get filed, and county work like this, sooner or later, papers always get filed. I'll know the name before the ink's dry. I'll send word if I hear anything worth sending." Roan thanked him, was halfway to the door when a voice stopped him. "Calder, Roan Calder?" He turned. An older man stood near the entrance, weathered, thick through the shoulders, studying Roan with the particular intensity of someone matching a face to a memory. "That's right. Silas Webb." The man extended a hand. "Knew your brother, Micah. Ranched not far from his spread back in Kiowa County before I came west myself." His grip was firm, his eyes sympathetic in a plain, unadorned way. "Sorry for what happened to him." Never got the chance to say that properly at the time. Roan felt something catch in his chest, the old grief rising sudden and unexpected the way it still sometimes did, 3 years on, when a stranger said Micah's name like he'd been a real person and not just a line in a letter. "Obliged to you for saying it now," Roan managed. "Man who did it," Webb said, lowering his voice slightly. "I heard he's been working west. Different name on the paperwork these days, but the same methods. Buys up water and mineral rights ahead of the railroad surveys, uses whatever pressure gets the job done fastest. I'd heard rumor he'd set his sights on Arizona territory next. Didn't think much of it till I heard your name mentioned same week. You heard my name mentioned. Fella asking around town about a rancher north of here. Married recent. To an Apache woman, so the talk went." Webb's expression turned grave. Didn't like the sound of the questions, if I'm honest. Wasn't friendly curiosity. Was the kind of asking a man does when he's building a case for something. Roan absorbed that, the cold certainty of it settling into his gut alongside everything else he'd learned that week. "Thank you," he said, "for the warning. And for what you said about Micah. He was a good man," Webb said. "Deserved better than what he got. You watch yourself out there, Calder. Men like the one chasing you don't stop on their own. They stop when somebody makes stopping cheaper than continuing. Roan thanked him, rode home slower than he'd ridden in, turning the conversation over the whole way, thinking that a man clever enough to hide behind a partner's name was a man who'd done this before, more than once, and had learned exactly how to keep his hands clean, while everything around him got dirty on his behalf. The Otis Corwin business came to light almost by accident, the way most betrayals do, not through some grand discovery, but through a small, stupid slip that a careful man would have avoided, and Otis, evidently, was not quite careful enough to avoid. The first hint came a week before the wolves. Roan had noticed a set of horse tracks along the eastern boundary of his property, tracks that didn't belong to any of his own stock, cutting close to the water source before turning back the way they'd come. He'd thought little of it at the time. A stray rider, maybe. Somebody lost. He thought differently about it now, standing at the general store counter 2 days after the wolf attack, waiting on his order, when he overheard two men talking low near the back, not troubling themselves to keep their voices as quiet as the conversation probably called for. Corwin's been asking around about water rights. Whole east section. Somebody paying him for the information, you ask me. None of my business what a man does with idle talk. Didn't sound idle to me. Sounded like a man building himself a nest egg off somebody else's land. Roan stood very still at that counter, because the words water rights and east section didn't belong to just anybody's land out here. They belonged to his. He found Otis 2 days later, out mending fence along the shared boundary between their two properties. Approach slow, deliberate. The way you approach a conversation you already know isn't going to go easy for either party involved. Otis. Roan. A nod. Otis kept working, didn't look up right away. Fence business? Water business, Roan said. Otis's hands went still on the wire. Don't know what you mean, I think you do. A long pause. The kind that says more than words would. Heard you've been asking questions about my property, Roan said. Water rights, specifically. Heard somebody's been paying for the asking. Heard a stranger's tracks along my eastern line the week before wolves got led into my corral on purpose. Otis went pale at that last part. Actually pale. The color draining out of him fast enough that Roan almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Before he remembered the two cattle with cuts still healing back home. Wolves? Roan. I swear to you. I never... Then what was it like? Fella came through town. Land agent. Said he was. Asking general questions about the area who's struggling. Who might sell. Otis's jaw worked. Offered good money for information. I didn't think much of it. Everybody talks about their neighbor's business out here, Roan. You know that. Not everybody sells it. Otis flinched at that. Actual flinch. Like the words had landed somewhere tender. I've got debts, he said quieter now. Bad year on my end. Didn't think it'd amount to anything. Man asked a few questions. I answered them. Took his money, figured that'd be the end of it. Was it the end of it? Otis didn't answer right away. He came back, he said finally. Asked more. About the water specifically. About whether you'd sell if the price was right. He looked up now, and there was something like genuine shame in his face. Though whether it was shame over what he'd done or shame over getting caught in Roan couldn't entirely say. I didn't know it'd come to wolves in your corral, Roan. I swear to you I didn't know that. I'd never have. I've got my own animals. My own fences. I wouldn't wish that on any man's livestock. But you knew enough, Roan said. You knew enough to keep taking his money after the second visit, after it stopped sounding like idle questions and started sounding like a man building a case. Otis had nothing to say to that, which was in its own way an answer complete enough. What did he look like? Roan asked, this land agent. Tall, gray at the temples. Good coat, better than the work called for. Didn't give a first name, just Rourke. Said he worked for a company out of the territorial capital, buying up water rights ahead of the railroad coming through eventually. Otis shook his head slow. Didn't think there was any harm in it at the time. Rourke. Roan filed the name away next to Draven's, the two of them sitting there together in his mind like two halves of the same bad coin. Roan rode home with that conversation sitting heavy in his chest. Not angry, exactly. Or not only angry. Something closer to tired the way a man gets tired when he realizes. The ground he thought was solid under him has more soft spots than he'd accounted for. He told Talise everything that evening. All of it. The overheard talk at the store. The confrontation at the fence line. Otis's excuses that weren't quite excuses. The name Rourke, sitting alongside Draven's like two pieces of the same puzzle, finally starting to show their shape. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet a long moment. "He is not your enemy," she said finally, meaning Otis. "He is a frightened man who made a bad choice, for understandable reasons. That does not make it a good choice. But it is not the same thing as the men who paid him. Feels the same right now. It will not feel the same tomorrow," she said. "Anger burns hot and fast. It rarely burns accurate." She looked at him steady. "Save the anger for Draven and this Rourke. Corwin is a symptom. They are the disease." Roan thought about that a long while. "You talk like someone who's had practice separating those two things," he said. Something moved behind her eyes. Brief. Gone before he could read it fully. "I have had a great deal of practice with a great many things," she said, and didn't elaborate further, and he didn't push, because he was starting to understand that some doors in her only opened when she decided the time was right, and pushing early only made her hold them shut that much longer. 2 evenings later, riding the western fence line at dusk, Roan caught sight of something on the ridge above the property. Still watching, too far off to make out clearly, gone by the time Roan turned Reuben fully toward the rise to get a better look. He didn't mention it to Talise right away. Turned it over in his mind first, the way he'd learned to turn things over before speaking them aloud, because half-formed worries had a way of growing teeth once they were spoken into the open air. But he noticed, over the following days, that she'd started watching that same ridge too, at almost the same hour, without either of them ever discussing it directly. Neither one of them mentioned it outright. But something had shifted between them regardless, a shared, unspoken understanding that whatever was circling them now wasn't wolves anymore and wasn't likely to announce itself so plainly a second time. 2 evenings after that first sighting, Roan decided he'd had enough of watching from a distance and waiting for the watching to turn into something worse. He rode out alone at dusk, telling Talise only that he wanted to check the western fence, which was true enough as far as it went. He climbed the rise where he'd seen the rider before, moving slow, careful, the way a man moves, when he isn't entirely sure what he's walking into. The rider was gone. But the ground wasn't empty, fresh horse tracks, deep enough to suggest a rider who'd sat there a good while, waiting, watching the ranch below, and near a flat rock where a man might have settled to smoke while he watched. A small object caught the last of the daylight, a cigar case. Silver, tarnished at the edges, monogrammed with 2 letters worked into the metal in careful script, GD. Roan turned it over in his hands, feeling something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the coming night air. Not a hired man watching on Draven's behalf. Draven himself. Close enough to sit on a ridge above the ranch and watch it with his own eyes, confident enough in his own reach out here, that he hadn't bothered sending someone else to do the watching for him. Roan pocketed the case, rode home slower than usual, the weight of it sitting heavier in his coat than a piece of tarnished silver had any right to sit. He showed it to Talise that night. She turned it over once in her hands, expression unreadable in the candlelight. "He wanted you to find this," she said finally. "Why would he want that?" "Because fear works better. Frightened man knows exactly who to be afraid of." She set the case down on the table between them. "This isn't carelessness. This is a message. He's telling you he isn't hiding anymore, which means whatever comes next, he no longer feels the need to disguise it." Roan looked at the small silver case sitting on his kitchen table and thought that a man confident enough to leave his own initials behind on purpose was a man who believed, somewhere deep down, that he'd already won. He intended to prove that belief wrong, whatever it took. The fire that night burned small and low, more for company than warmth. Talise sat close to it, knees drawn up, watching the flames the way she watched everything, patient, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world, even though Roan suspected, more and more with each passing week, that time had rarely been a kindness to her. He sat a few feet off, didn't push into the silence. Had learned, slow but learned all the same, that her silences were working silences, things being sorted through, decided on her own internal schedule. After a long while, she spoke without turning toward him. "You asked me once on the trail," she said, "what a person learns to do to survive. I remember. I want to tell you the rest of it," she said, "if you'll let me." He said nothing, just waited. Because he understood, without her having to explain it, that this was an offering, and offerings don't need encouragement so much as they need room. "When I was young," she said, My mother was the finest healer our people had known in a generation, maybe longer than that. She understood the land the way most people understand their own hands, without having to think about it, without having to try. Her voice stayed level, practiced level, the kind a person builds specifically so a story like this one can be told, without the telling breaking them apart in the process. Her name was Noeta. She let the name sit there a moment, like she was testing whether the desert air would hold it without judgment. She taught me everything: how to read weather in stone, how to find water where no water should exist, how to set a broken bone, how to bring down a fever, how to track an animal by the weight it puts down and the weight it doesn't. I was good at all of it. A pause. Better than good, if I am honest. And my mother taught me that honesty about one's own gifts is not the same thing as pride. What happened to her? Talise was quiet a moment. There were men in the council who did not like what she could do, she said. Not because it was wrong, because it made them small, standing next to her. A healer who understands more than the men who claim to lead, that is a dangerous thing to certain kinds of men. Not dangerous because of anything she did, dangerous because of what she made them feel, standing in her shadow. So they turned on her. They called her other things instead of what she was, things that were not true, and when she died, Talise stopped, started again, careful. When she died of a fever nobody could name and nobody could stop, the council decided she should not be remembered by name. My father argued against it. He was chief, but even a chief cannot win every argument against a council determined to win. I was 7 years old. I remember standing at the edge of the gathering while men who had once asked her advice now voted to erase the only proof she'd ever existed. So they erased her. They tried. Something hardened in Talise's voice, quiet but unmistakable. I grew up knowing my mother's hands and my mother's knowledge, and being taught in 100 small ways, not to say where either one came from. Because I was good at what she'd taught me better than good, and I understood very young what that goodness had cost her. So I learned to be smaller. I stopped showing what I knew. I became quiet, because quiet was invisible, and invisible felt like the only safety left available to me. Roan sat with that a long while. The fire popped once, low, and neither of them moved. So when the warriors came asking for you, he said slowly, working it through as he said it, and found reasons to walk away. They were not walking away from a flaw, Talise said. They were walking away from what I could become, if I ever stopped hiding it. A man cannot stand beside a wife who makes him feel small in front of his own people. He cannot protect a woman who does not need his protecting. What would the other warriors say? What would his own children think of him? In time. She looked at the fire, not at him. So they gave other reasons instead. She is too tall, her hands are too rough. She does not smile enough. Easier reasons. Reasons that don't require a man to admit what he's actually afraid of. The men who walked away from you said we're fools. He said it plain. Not as comfort, as fact. The same way she said things when she meant them entirely. Something moved through Talise's face. Something he hadn't seen there before. Not the careful, almost smiles he'd caught once or twice over these last weeks, but something fuller. Something real, starting deep in her eyes and changing everything below them. No one has said that to me before, she said quietly. Not once, in all these years. Then it was past time somebody did. She looked at him a long moment across the low fire. My father, she said, loves his people, and he loves me. He could not change the council's mind with words. Not fully. So when you rode in with Kola, when he saw a way to give me a life outside the reach of what they'd already decided about me, she stopped, started again. He used the moment. I understood that even then, standing under that blanket. He was not simply repaying a debt, he was finding me a door. I know, Roan said. Took me a while to see it clear. But I know now. He used us both, she said. We both gained something. We both lost something too. That is how these arrangements usually go, in my experience. What did you lose? She considered the question a long moment, like it deserved more care than a quick answer would give it. The choosing, she said finally. I have never once, in my whole life, been asked what I wanted, only ever told what was available to me, and left to decide how to survive inside those limits. Roan absorbed that, felt the weight of it settle somewhere behind his ribs. I can't undo what already happened, he said. The way this started. I know that. But from here forward, he paused, choosing the words with more care than he usually bothered to choose anything. From here forward, you get to choose. Anything you want changed about how we live out here, you tell me, and we change it. That much I can promise you plain. Talise looked at him a long moment, something considering behind her eyes, the same careful calculation he'd seen her run on everything from a horse's hoof to a flood, 2 hours before it arrived. I will remember you said that, she said. I do not forget promises, especially not ones people don't expect me to hold them to. Good, Roan said. Because I meant it, they sat by the fire a while longer, the silence between them different now than it had been even an hour before. Not lighter, exactly. Grief doesn't get lighter just because it finally gets spoken out loud, but shared, carried by 2 people instead of 1, which is its own kind of relief even when the weight itself doesn't change. At some point, without either of them quite deciding to let it happen, her hand came to rest near his on the ground between them. Not touching. Close enough that the closeness itself said something neither one of them was ready yet to put into words. Roan looked at the fire, thought about the badge sitting in a drawer in the house behind them, a threat with a name attached now, and now a second name too, Rourke waiting for whatever came next. Thought about Noetta's name, spoken out loud into this same wide desert air for what might have been the first time in years. Thought that somewhere between a lost brother and a lost mother, 2 people who'd started this arrangement as strangers bound by a debt neither of them had chosen, were building something that had started against every reasonable expectation to feel like it might actually hold. Talise, he said. Yes, whatever's coming next, with Draven, with Rourke, with all of it. He looked at her. You won't be facing it alone. I want that understood plain, same as every... She held his gaze a long moment in the low firelight. I know, she said, quiet, certain. You know, I decided that, she said, the night the wolves came, and you stood at that fence with a rifle in your shaking hands and fired anyway even when you couldn't get a clean shot, and didn't run, when it would have been the easier thing to do. A small pause, almost the shape of a smile. A man who doesn't run when he's frightened. That tells a person something worth knowing. Roan almost laughed, caught himself, because the moment felt too fragile, too newly built, to risk breaking with the wrong kind of sound. I was plenty frightened, he admitted. I know, she said again. That is exactly what I mean. Later, long after the fire had burned to coals and Talise had gone into sleep, Roan sat alone under the wide dark sky, turning the whole night over in his mind. He thought about the badge. About Draven's name surfacing again after 3 years of silence, like a debt of his own finally coming due. About Rourke's name sitting alongside it now, 2 men instead of 1, which somehow made the whole thing feel both more dangerous and, strangely, more possible to fight, because a conspiracy with 2 names attached to it was a conspiracy that could eventually be traced, documented, dragged out into daylight, where men like that generally didn't survive very well. He thought about Otis Corwin, weak rather than cruel, and how those 2 things could look nearly identical from a distance, but meant something entirely different up close. He thought about Noetta, about a woman erased for the crime of being better than the men who feared her, about how that fear, once it takes root in a place, doesn't just stay contained to one family, one camp, one century. It travels. It finds new soil wherever soil is willing to receive it. He thought that maybe the real fight ahead of him wasn't only about land, or water, or 2 names on a badge and in a stranger's mouth at the general store. Maybe it was about proving, in whatever small way one ranch in Arizona territory could prove anything at all, that a person's worth didn't have to be measured by how comfortable it made everyone else feel standing next to it. He looked up at the stars, more of them than any sky had reasonable business holding, and thought, before sleep finally found him, whatever Draven and Rourke were planning next, they were going to have to get through both of them to manage it. Both of them. Not just him. That thought settled something in his chest that had been unsettled for a long while. The next morning, Roan sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a sheet of paper. He rarely had occasion to use for anything beyond counting cattle. He wrote it all down. The badge, found near the bait site, with its name and county stamped plain across the brass. The cigar case, monogram, found on the ridge where a man had sat watching the ranch with his own eyes, rather than trusting the watching to a hired hand. Otis Corwin's account of a land agent calling himself Rourke, asking pointed questions about water rights, paying for answers a neighbor should never have sold. Silas Webb's warning in Tucson, connecting Draven's name to a pattern of buying up water and mineral rights ahead of railroad surveys, using pressure when persuasion failed to move fast enough. Talise read over his shoulder when he finished, quiet. "Why write it down?" she asked. "You already carry all of it plainly enough in your head." "Because a man's memory can be argued with," Roan said. "Paper's harder to argue with. If this ever needs showing to somebody with the authority to do something about it, a marshal, a judge, anybody outside this county who hasn't already been bought, I want it laid out plain, not left to whatever I happen to remember on the day it's asked of me." She considered that a long moment. Something like respect settled into her expression. "That is good thinking," she said. "My father would call that the mind of someone building for a fight he intends to win, not simply survive." "I'll take the compliment," Roan said, assuming that's what it was. "It was," she said. "I don't offer many, I don't mean." He folded the paper carefully, tucked it into the same drawer where the badge and the cigar case already sat, evidence accumulating slow but steady, the way a case builds itself out of small true things laid one on top of another, until the weight of them together becomes impossible to dismiss. Whatever Draven and Rourke believed they'd built out here, whatever confidence had let a man leave his own monogrammed silver behind on a ridge, certain nobody would ever be organized enough to use it against him, Roan intended to prove, piece by careful piece, exactly how wrong that confidence was. This is a work of fiction inspired by frontier life in the American West of the 1880s. Character names, tribal customs, and events are invented for storytelling purposes and are not intended to represent any specific historical person, community, or documented tradition. He came on a Tuesday. Roan would remember that detail long after most of the rest had blurred together, the way the small, useless facts sometimes outlast the large, important ones. A Tuesday, mid-morning, the kind of ordinary light that has no business witnessing anything significant and ends up witnessing it anyway. He'd felt it coming, if he was honest about it. Not the specific day, just the general shape of it. The way a man feels weather building somewhere past the ridge before it ever shows itself plainly in the sky. Because a man like Draven doesn't simply vanish after leaving a monogrammed cigar case behind on purpose. Because leaving something like that behind is its own kind of promise, and a promise like that doesn't sit quiet forever. He'd mentioned as much to Talise the night before, lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling. "You think he's coming himself," she'd said. "Not really a question. I think a man who wants you to know his name doesn't send somebody else to finish the conversation." She'd been quiet a long moment. "Then we finish it together, whatever shape it takes." He hadn't argued that. Hadn't wanted to if he was honest. Two men in a buckboard. Good coats. Good boots. The kind of good that costs more than a rancher spends on himself in a year. Worn by a man who wants you to notice the cost without him having to mention it directly. The one holding the reins climbed down first. Gray hair combed clean, posture built from decades of being the person a room arranged itself around. He didn't knock at the gate. Didn't need to. Just stood there like the ground itself owed him passage. Same as every acre he'd ever set eyes on before. Roan called her. Not a question, a confirmation the way a man reads a name off a deed he's already decided belongs to him. "I'm Garrick Draven. I'd like a few minutes of your time, if you can spare them." There it was. The name that had been living quiet in the back of Roan's mind for 3 years, sitting in a letter, sitting in a badge pulled from burlap, sitting in a cigar case left deliberately on a ridge, and now standing at his gate in a good coat on a Tuesday morning, like the whole thing was a simple matter of business between two reasonable men. Roan didn't extend his hand. "I know who you are," he said. Something flickered behind Draven's eyes. Small, recalculated, gone as fast as it arrived, replaced with the same easy composure that probably worked on most men who hadn't spent 3 years turning his name over in the dark. "Then you understand I'm a fair and careful businessman," Draven said. "I'm prepared to offer considerably more than the assessed value of this land. Enough to start somewhere better suited to whatever you're building here. Not selling. I haven't named a figure yet. Doesn't matter what figure you name." Draven's smile stayed put, but something behind it tightened. "You understand what you're sitting on here, then, which makes my offer more generous than it might appear at first glance." "I understand exactly what I'm sitting on," Roan said, "which is why the answer's no." The side door opened. Talise came out. Didn't come and stand behind him. Didn't come at an angle. Came and stood directly beside him, shoulder near his shoulder, facing Draven with the same calm, measuring expression she turned on everything. No weapon visible, no display of any kind. Just a woman standing in her own yard, looking at a problem she'd already started solving in her head. Draven looked at her, She looked back. Something in his practiced composure bent. Not much. Just enough that a person watching closely would notice. This land is not for sale, she said. Quiet. Without heat. The water beneath it is not for sale either. The deed was filed correctly, and you already know that because you've checked. Whatever happened in Oklahoma. A pause, deliberate, letting the word Oklahoma sit in the air between them a moment longer than comfortable. That was one man alone. This is different. Draven's jaw worked once. It doesn't have to be complicated. It isn't complicated, Talise said. The answer is no. He looked at them both a long moment. The look of a man doing quiet arithmetic, running figures that weren't adding up the way he'd expected them to. You'll want to reconsider, he said finally. Voice had lost a shade of its warmth. Difficulties have a way of finding people who don't understand when a door's being held open for them. Is that a threat? Roan said. Draven adjusted his coat. I don't threaten anyone. I simply note that certain choices make a man's path harder than it needs to be. He climbed back into the buckboard, took the reins, looked back once before turning the horses toward the road, and the way he did it calm, patient, entirely unhurried, was worse than anger would have been. It was the look of a man who considered this a delay, not an ending. They watched the buckboard disappear over the rise. He'll try something else, Talise said soon. Not talk, next time. I know. Then we need to move faster than he expects us to. Word from Tucson arrived 4 days later, carried by a rider Roan didn't recognize. A young man paid to deliver a sealed envelope and nothing more. Inside, in the careful hand of the land office clerk Whitfield, his name turned out to be, though he'd never offered it directly before. A message written plain enough to leave no room for comfortable misunderstanding. Papers filed. Amended survey on the eastern boundary of your property. Water source specifically. Filing clerk of record. E. Rourke. Recommend you come see this yourself and soon. Something is very wrong with the dates on these documents. Roan read it twice. Handed it to Talise without a word. She read it once. Set it down slow. Rourke, she said. Not simply an agent asking questions anymore. Filing clerk, Roan said. Man's inside the system, not working around it. Working through it. They rode for the county seat 2 days later, leaving before dawn to make the distance in a single hard push. Neither of them said much along the way. The kind of quiet that isn't empty. The kind that's full of a person turning over everything they intend to say once they arrive. Rehearsing it, discarding it, starting over. The land office sat squat and unremarkable on the main street. The kind of building nobody looks at, twice, until the day they need something from inside it badly enough to notice how ordinary it looks from the outside, for something capable of holding so much power over so many lives. Whitfield met them at the counter. Older, ink-stained, eyes carrying the particular weariness of a man who'd spent decades watching honest work get quietly undone by dishonest paperwork and had run out of patience for pretending otherwise. Mr. Calder, a nod toward Talise, ma'am. Glad you came quick. Show us, Roan said. He laid the documents out across the counter. 2 surveys, side by side, one dated 18 months back, filed properly, matching the original deed Roan had held since he first claimed the land. The second dated only 3 weeks prior. Boundary lines shifted subtly enough that a careless reader might miss it entirely. Except the shift ran directly through the water source, moving it from Calder land onto a parcel, newly claimed under a different name. Whose name, Roan asked, though some part of him already knew the shape of the answer before it arrived. Company out of the territorial capital, Whitfield said. Paperwork's clean on its face, except he pulled a third document from beneath the others. This is the surveyor's original field notation. I kept a copy, which I wasn't strictly required to do, but I've learned to keep copies of things that smell are wrong before they're filed properly, because sometimes the filed version and the original don't match up quite as neatly as they should. The original notation showed the boundary exactly where it had always been. The filed survey didn't. Somebody altered it, Talise said. After the fact. Somebody with access to alter it, Whitfield said, and the authority to file the altered version without anybody thinking twice about checking it against the original, which narrows the list of who could have managed it considerably. Rourke, Roan said. Rourke, Whitfield agreed. Filing clerk of record on both documents. Man's been quiet about it, careful. The kind of careful that tells you he's done this before somewhere else and learned exactly how thin to spread the changes so nobody notices till it's too late to easily undo. They found him 20 minutes later, in the back room where the county kept its older filings. bent over a filing cabinet, a stack of documents in one hand and a lit match in the other, close enough to a small metal waste bin that the intent was plain to read even before Roan said a word. Rourke. The match dropped, hissed out against the floor. Rourke spun, face going the color of old paper. This isn't what it looks like. It looks like a man burning evidence, Talise said, stepping into the doorway behind Roan, blocking the only other way out, which I notice is exactly what it is. I was cleaning. Old files no longer relevant. The survey with your name on it, Roan said, dated 3 weeks back. That old to you? Rourke's hand trembled around the remaining papers. For a moment, Roan thought the man might bolt anyway, match or no match, straight past both of them and out into the street. Something in his eyes weighed it, calculated the odds, found them wanting. He said it would be simple, Rourke said finally, voice cracking. Said nobody checks a boundary line that's only moved a few hundred feet. Said I'd be paid enough to leave this job behind entirely once it was done. And now? Now I understand he never intended to let me leave anything behind. Rourke said, bitter. Man like Draven doesn't pay off loose ends. He removes them, one way or another, once they've stopped being useful. Roan looked at the papers, still clutched in Rourke's shaking hand. Then here's your chance to be useful in a different direction, asked. Testify. Plainly, in front of the inspector, in front of everybody who needs to hear it. Might not save your position. Might save you from whatever Draven's got planned for a clerk who knows too much and has stopped being convenient. Rourke was quiet a long moment, looked at the half-burned match on the floor, at the document still clutched too tight in his own hand. I'll testify, he said, finally, barely above a whisper. God help me. I'll testify. Roan felt something cold and clear settle into him, not rage exactly. Something steadier than rage. The particular calm of a man who finally has a shape to fight instead of a shadow. Can this be undone, he asked, legally? Yes, if it's caught in time and proven in front of the right authority. Whitfield's expression turned grim, which is where it gets complicated. Rourke's not some clerk working alone out of greed. Man like Draven doesn't buy one clerk. He buys the whole chain, usually clerk surveyor, sometimes a judge if the territory's small enough and the money's large enough. I don't know how far up this particular chain runs. Then we find out, Talise said, all of it. Before we bring this to anyone with the power to fix it, we make certain we know exactly how deep the rot runs, so it can't hide in some corner nobody thought to check. Whitfield looked at her a long moment, something like respect moving behind his tired eyes. There's a territorial land inspector due through in about 2 weeks, he said. Fella named Pruitt. Comes through this circuit twice a year, checking filings for exactly this kind of irregularity, though he usually finds nothing worth his trouble, because most men doing this kind of thing are smarter than to leave a trail he can follow easily. He tapped the altered survey. This trail, though, if you can bring him more than paper, if you can bring him witnesses, physical proof, a full accounting, that's the kind of case that doesn't get buried quietly, even by men with Draven's kind of reach. They rode home with 2 weeks sitting ahead of them like a held breath. Roan spent the ride turning it over, piece by piece, the same way he'd turned over every hard thing in his life, since Micah's porch 3 years back, except this time the turning felt different. Less like carrying a weight alone in the dark, more like assembling something with a clear shape and a clear purpose, one true fact laid carefully against the next. We can't do this alone, he said finally, breaking the long quiet between them. 2 weeks isn't much time to build a case strong enough to survive a man like Draven pushing back against it. No, Talise agreed. We can't. Your father, already thinking the same thing, she said. The water beneath your land runs beneath ours, too. What threatens you threatens my people exactly as much. My father will understand that faster than most men would, because he's spent his whole life watching what happens when outsiders decide a piece of land is worth more than the people living on it. Kesto listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, weighing each piece before he let himself react to any of it. When Roan finished laying it all out, the badge, the cigar case, Otis's testimony, Silas Webb's warning, the altered survey, Rourke's name sitting at the center of it like a spider that had spun itself carefully into the middle of a web. Nobody was supposed to notice. Kesto was quiet a long moment. This is not new, he said finally. Only the names change. My grandfather fought men exactly like this one. My father fought too in his own way, though he lost more of those fights than he won. He looked at Roan, then at Talise. But he never had what you have now. Proof. written down, carried by people willing to say it out loud where it matters. We need more than proof, Tossie said. We need enough voices behind it that Draven can't simply buy his way past the inconvenience of it. If it's only us, he'll find a way to make it disappear before this inspector ever arrives. Kesto nodded slow. Then we gather voices, he said. My people. Yours, Calder, the ones willing to stand plainly against a man like this. Corwin, if he's willing to speak honestly about what he's already confessed to you privately. A pause. And Wessa. There is something Wessa has carried a long while that belongs in this reckoning, too, whether either of you fully understands that yet or not. Talisa's eyes moved to her father, something careful and uncertain crossing her face. Father, not yet, Kesto said gently. When the moment is right, you will know it when it arrives. I believe that moment is close now. The 2 weeks that followed moved fast and slow at once, the particular strange rhythm of time, when a person is building towards something they can feel coming, but can't yet see the full shape of. A woman named Mara Jenkins rode out from 2 counties over during that same stretch, word of the healer having finally traveled far enough to reach her. Her husband had taken a fever that wouldn't break, doctors in his own county having run out of ideas that worked. Talise went, same as she always did, and spent the better part of a day working over him, with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. And by the following morning, the fever had finally loosened its grip. Mara found Roan afterward, near the wagon, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. I heard talk, she said. Careful. About some trouble your family's facing, land trouble, water trouble. She glanced back toward the house where Talise was cleaning her hands at the pump. If there's a day where good word from a grateful stranger might carry some weight, you send for me. I'll come stand and say plainly what she did for my husband. Won't cost either of you a thing but my time, and I've got plenty of that to spare for a debt this size. Roan hadn't expected the offer, hadn't gone looking for it. Obliged, he managed. Truly. Don't thank me yet, Mara said, climbing back onto her wagon. Thank me the day I actually stand up and say it in front of people who might not want to hear it. She kept her word in the end, standing near the back of the gathering at the appointed time, though her testimony never quite got called for Otis and Webb, and Whitfield's evidence had proven enough on their own. But she'd come anyway, ready, and that readiness was its own kind of proof that the county's opinion of the Calder Ranch had already begun shifting, long before Draven ever stood there to hear it confirmed out loud. Otis Corwin agreed to speak, reluctant but resolved, the shame of what he'd done evidently having sat with him long enough to curdle into something closer to determination to help set it right. I owe you that much, he told Roan, standing at the same fence line where the truth had first come out between them. More than that, probably, but it's what I've got to offer. Silas Webb, reached by letter, sent a signed account of everything he'd told Roan in Tucson, along with a note that he'd be willing to travel and testify in person if the matter required it. Whitfield prepared his copies, his careful documentation of the altered survey against the original field notes, everything laid out in the particular precise language of a man who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how to make paperwork, tell an honest story even when somebody else had tried hard to make it lie. And Kesto, quietly, without much fanfare, spoke to the council, the same council, Roan understood without needing it spelled out, that had once voted to erase a healer's name from memory rather than admit what her gifts had made them feel standing in her shadow. Ruth Hazlitt agreed to speak too, when Roan rode out to ask her plainly whether she'd be willing. Wondered when somebody was finally going to do something about that man, she said, not even pretending to hesitate. Word travels between ranch wives faster than you'd think, Mr. Calder. I've heard his name connected to trouble in 2 other counties already this year. I'll stand up and say my piece gladly. Man like that thrives on nobody being willing to speak plainly in front of him. Time somebody was. The night before the gathering, Roan couldn't settle. Paced the kitchen twice before Talise finally set down the mending in her lap and looked at him. You're wearing a path on my floor, our floor, he said. And I'm nervous, I noticed. You're not. I am, she said. I'm simply better at not showing it than you are, which I would have thought you'd have learned about me by now. He almost laughed. Fair point. If this goes poorly tomorrow, she said, setting the mending aside entirely, we will still have this land. We will still have each other. Draven can take a great many things from a great many people, but he cannot take that, whatever else happens in front of that inspector. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to be true, she said. Whether it makes you feel better is a separate matter entirely, and frankly not something I have much control over. He sat down across from her. You're doing that thing again, where you say something plain and it somehow helps anyway. It's a gift, she said, and this time she did smile, small and real. Now stop pacing and come sit. Tomorrow will arrive, whether you wear a hole in this floor tonight or not. He sat, and found to his own quiet relief that she was right. The pacing hadn't been helping anything at all. The gathering happened on the appointed day at the edge of the Apache camp, chosen deliberately as neutral ground, close enough to town that Inspector Pruitt could reach it without excessive difficulty, close enough to the water source, in dispute, that its relevance couldn't be argued away as some distant abstraction. Roan had never seen so many people in one place out here. Ranchers he recognized from town, Ruth Hazlitt among them, arms crossed, watching everything with her sharp assessing eyes. Otis Corp, standing a little apart, uncertain but present, which counted for something. Warriors and elders from the camp, Tewan near the front, Wessa seated with the particular stillness of a man who has waited a long time for a moment he wasn't entirely certain would ever arrive. Inspector Pruitt stood near a small table set up for the purpose, a compact, unhurried man, with the careful eyes of someone who'd spent a career learning not to be impressed by good coats or confident postures. And Draven, arriving late, deliberately late, the way a man arrives when he wants a room to have already noticed his absence before it notices his presence. Beside him, a thin, nervous man Roan hadn't met before but recognized instantly from the careful way he avoided meeting anybody's eyes. Elias Rourke. This is highly irregular, Draven said, before anyone had properly begun. Gathering half a county and half a camp to discuss a private land matter. I'm not certain what you imagine this accomplishes. It accomplishes transparency, Inspector Pruitt said mildly, which in my experience is precisely the thing men in your position tend to find most inconvenient. Mr. Calder, you have documents you'd like entered into record? Roan stepped forward. His hands weren't entirely steady, and he let them not be steady, because pretending otherwise in front of this many watching faces would have cost him more than the shaking itself. He laid out the badge first, then the cigar case, then Whitfield's careful comparison of the two surveys, original against altered, the discrepancy plain enough that even Pruitt's careful, unimpressed eyes widened slightly studying it. This badge, Pruitt said, turning it over, bears your name, Mr. Draven. Found, I'm told, at a site where wolves were deliberately driven onto Mr. Calder's property. I have no knowledge of any. Wolves, Draven said smoothly. Badges get lost, stolen even. I couldn't begin to account for where a lost item might turn up. And this cigar case, also bearing your initials, found on a ridge overlooking the same property, at a location consistent with someone from the ranch at length. Coincidence, Draven said. I've traveled this territory extensively on legitimate business. I could have dropped that case anywhere. Convenient coincidences, Pruitt said, do have a way of accumulating around certain men more than others. Otis Corwin spoke next, voice unsteady but clear enough to carry. He told it plain. The payments, the questions about water rights, Rourke's visits, the second visit where the questions had turned, pointed enough to worry him even before the wolves ever confirmed his worry had been justified. Rourke's face had gone the color of old paper by the time Otis finished. This man is disgruntled, Draven said. Owes debts by his own admission. Men in that position will say a great deal for the promise of sympathy, or worse, for payment from whoever's willing to offer it. Nobody's paid me for this, Otis said, sharper than Roan had ever heard him speak. I've got nothing to gain here, Draven. I'm standing up here admitting to my own neighbors that I took your money and regretted it the moment I understood what it cost. That's not a man angling for sympathy. That's a man trying to undo a mistake before it costs somebody else worse than it already cost me. Whitfield presented the surveys last, laying the original field notation beside the filed version, tracing the discrepancy with a steady finger for the whole assembled crowd to see plainly. The boundary was moved, he said, after filing, by someone with access to Alter County records without triggering the usual review. I've worked this office 11 years. I know exactly how many hands would need to touch a document for a change like this to slip through unnoticed. Pruitt turned to Rourke. Mr. Rourke, you're the filing clerk of record on both documents. Perhaps you'd care to explain the discrepancy. Rourke opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes flicked toward Draven, who held his gaze steady, cold, a warning plain enough that everybody near the front of the crowd could read it without difficulty. His voice failed him entirely. Mr. Rourke, Roan said, quiet but carrying. You told us 2 days ago in that back room that you'd testify. Whatever he's promising you with that look right now, remember what he actually delivers to men who stop being convenient to him. Something in Rourke's face crumbled. I altered the survey, he said. Words tumbling out fast now, the way a dam gives way after holding too long against too much pressure. On his instruction. He paid me, and when I asked what would keep him from simply removing me once I'd finished being useful, he made it plain enough what happens to men who know too much and outlive their purpose. He looked up, first at Pruitt, then briefly, unable to help it, at Drape. He arranged the wolves, too. Paid a man out of Tucson to bait them onto the Calder property. Wanted it to look natural. Wanted Calder frightened enough to sell before he ever suspected a person stood behind any of it. The silence that followed stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of verdict. Mr. Draven, Pruitt said finally, I've seen enough here to warrant a full territorial investigation into your operations in this county, and likely several others besides, given the pattern Mr. Webb's account and Mr. Calder's documentation together suggest. I'd advise you to consider very carefully how you wish to proceed from this point forward. Draven's composure, for the first time since he'd climbed down from that buckboard weeks ago, showed a genuine crack. This is nothing, he said. Circumstantial. A badge, a cigar case, the word of a debt-ridden neighbor and a disgruntled and a survey, with the field notes to prove exactly how it was altered, Pruitt said, and a pattern stretching back to Kiowa County, Oklahoma, where a man died over a boundary dispute that, by Mr. Webb's account, bears every hallmark of your usual methods. I don't need certainty today, Mr. Draven. I need enough to open the investigation properly. You've given me considerably more than enough. Draven's eyes moved once, quick, calculating, and something in his expression shifted toward a different kind of strategy entirely. Inspector Pruitt, he said, voice smoothing back into something almost pleasant. Perhaps we might discuss this privately. I'm certain a reasonable arrangement could be reached that serves everyone's interests more efficiently than a lengthy public investigation. The crowd went very still. Pruitt's expression didn't change at all, which was somehow more damning than if it had. Mr. Draven, Pruitt said, did you just offer me a bribe in front of half a county and an Apache council? I offered no such thing. I merely suggested. I heard exactly what you suggested, Pruitt said. And I'll be noting it in my report alongside everything else, since you've been generous enough to provide one final piece of evidence I hadn't even needed to ask for. He turned to a young clerk seated beside him, already writing. Strike nothing. Record it precisely as spoken. A low murmur moved through the crowd, not quite laughter, but close enough to it that Draven's face darkened considerably. Draven looked around the gathered crowd, ranchers, Apache elders, the Inspector Roan and Talise standing together near the front of it all, and understood, plain as anything, that whatever ground he'd thought he was standing on had shifted entirely beneath him while he wasn't paying close enough attention. This isn't finished, he said. Low meant mostly for Roan alone, even as the words carried further than he probably intended. It is for you, Roan said. Here, anyway. Draven turned, walked back toward the buckboard without another word, Rourke scrambling after him, and the two of them rode out under the weight of every watching eye in that gathering, which was, Roan thought, its own particular kind of justice, not loud, not violent, but complete in its own quiet way. The crowd began to loosen, conversations breaking out in small clusters, the particular relief of people who'd watched something dangerous properly named and properly handled, instead of left to fester in the dark. And then Wessa stood. The old man moved slow, deliberate, leaning on his walking stick, and something in the way he rose drew the whole gathering's attention back to stillness without him having to ask for it. He looked at Talise a long moment, then at Kesto. Then he spoke, his voice carrying further than Roan would have expected from a man his age, clear enough that nobody standing anywhere near that gathering could claim afterward they hadn't heard it plainly. There is one more matter, Wessa said, that has waited too long already. He turned to the council members standing among the crowd, the same men, some of them who decades before had voted to erase a name, rather than admit what that name's owner had made them feel. Standing in her shadow, I watched a woman today stand in front of this territory's own law and speak the truth plainly, without flinching, though she had every reason to expect it might cost her. Wessa's eyes found Talise's. I watched her father stand beside her, I watched a man who is not of our blood stand beside her too and mean it fully. He paused. The whole gathering had gone silent, waiting. Her mother would have stood exactly the same way, Wessa said, because her mother taught her how. He said the name, clear, unhurried, into the open air of that gathering, in front of the council, in front of the whole assembled crowd, in front of Kesto and T1, and every warrior who'd once turned from Talise without understanding what they were truly turning from, Noeda. The name landed into that crowd like something long held, finally set down. For a moment, Talise wasn't standing in that gathering at all. She was 7 years old again, crouched at the edge of a cook fire, watching her mother's hands move over a wound on a hunter's arm, with the same unhurried precision Talise's own hands had learned to carry since. She remembered her mother catching her watching, smiling, saying, "Quiet, just between them. Someday your hands will know more than mine do. That is not something to hide, little one. That is something to carry forward." She hadn't understood, at 7, what that promise would eventually cost. She understood it now, standing here decades later, hearing that same name spoken proudly instead of erased. Kesto closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had eased in his weathered face that Roan hadn't seen there before. Not once in all the weeks he'd known the man. "Noeta," Kesto said, repeating it, his voice carrying its own particular weight. She would be proud of what her daughter has become. I should have said this years ago. I say it now instead, because now is the time I finally have the courage to say it in front of everyone who needs to hear it. Talise stood very still. Roan watched her, close enough to see the effort it cost her to hold herself steady, the particular discipline of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning not to let this kind of moment show on her face, and was now, for the first time, allowing herself to let it show anyway. Tears. Not many, but real, and unhidden, which for her, Roan understood, was its own kind of victory larger than anything that had happened with Draven that whole afternoon. She said the name too. Quiet just once, meant mostly for herself. Noeta. The gathering began to disperse slowly after that, small conversations rising up around the edges, people offering quiet words to Kesto, to Talise, the particular gentle aftermath of a community that had just watched something true and overdue finally happen in front of them. Ruth Hazlitt found Roan near the edge of the crowd. "Well," she said, "that was quite an afternoon. Wasn't planning on it going quite this far when I started," Roan admitted. "Most important afternoons don't announce themselves in advance," Ruth said. "Your wife's a remarkable woman, Mr. Calder. Whole county's going to know it properly now, whether they were ready to admit it before today or not." She left before he could find a proper answer, which was probably for the best, because he wasn't sure he had one that would have done the moment justice. Otis Corwin approached them both, before the crowd finished thinning. Hat in hand, the way he'd held it, that first afternoon he'd ridden out for a length of chain, though everything about him seemed to sit differently now, lighter for having finally said the hard thing out loud in front of people who mattered. "Didn't know if I'd be welcome, standing near you two after today," he said. "Wanted to say it anyway. What you built here, the case, the evidence, all of it, that took more steadiness than I had in me when Draven's money first came asking. I'm sorry I made you need that steadiness in the first place. You stood up today," Talise said, "in front of your whole county. That took its own kind of steadiness." Otis looked at her a long moment, something like surprise crossing his face, as though he hadn't expected the words to come from her rather than from Roan. "Obliged to you for saying so," he managed. He nodded once to Roan, settled his hat back on, and walked off toward his own horse, and Roan noticed, watching him go, that he stood a little straighter than he had in weeks. Kesto found them last, as the crowd thinned toward evening, the low sun turning the whole gathering ground the color of banked coals. "This was a good day," he said simply. "Not an easy one, but a good one." "Wasn't sure it would go this way when we started," Roan admitted. "Few good days announced themselves clearly at the start," Kesto said. "That is usually how you know they were worth the difficulty getting there." He looked at his daughter a long moment, something settled and unguarded in his weathered face that Roan hadn't seen there even at the ceremony months before. "I am proud of you. I should have found more chances to say that plainly over the years. I intend to say it more, from here forward." Talise didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice carried a warmth Roan had rarely heard directed at anyone but himself. "I heard you the first time," she said. "I'll be glad to hear it again, as often as you care to say it." Kesto almost smiled rare enough from him, that Roan noted it the way he'd note any rare weather worth remembering. Then the old chief mounted his horse, Tawan falling in beside him, and the two of them rode toward the ridge as the last of the daylight settled gold and red across the whole gathered ground. That evening, back at the ranch, the fire burned low between them, the same as it had so many nights before, except everything about the quiet felt different now. Lighter. Not empty of weight, grief, and reckoning, don't simply evaporate because justice finally arrives, but carried differently. Carried like something set down rather than something dragged. He said Noetta. Talise said, mostly to herself, staring into the flames. In front of everyone. He did. I used to say her name only inside my own head, she said. Only at night, when no one could possibly hear me say it. You can say it out loud now, Roan said. Here. Whenever you want. For the rest of your life, if that's what you want. She was quiet a long moment. Then she said it once more, clear as water moving over stone. Noetta. The desert held the name the way it held everything, without judgment, without hurry, simply receiving it. The way open places receive the things people finally find the courage to set down inside them. Tassis, Rowan said after a while. Yes. I should have said this weeks ago. Maybe should have said it the morning that blanket fell, and I stood there like a fool, discovering the floor was solid under me the whole time. He looked at her, and found, to his own mild surprise, that the words came easier than he'd expected once he finally let himself reach for them plainly. I love you. Not because of the debt, not because of any of it starting the way it started, because of every single day since. Because of a woman who reads floods out of clear stone and heals horses nobody else can touch and stood beside me today, in front of half this territory, without once looking like she doubted whether she belonged there. Talise looked at him a long moment, the firelight moving soft across her face. You have said true things to me before, she said quietly. But not that one. Not until tonight. Then it was past time I did. She reached across the small distance between them, placed her hand over his, warm from the fire, steady in a way that told him everything her words hadn't quite finished saying yet. I love you, she said. Simple. Direct. The way she said every true thing in her life. I have for a while now, if I am honest with myself about it. I did not say it because I was not certain yet that saying it wouldn't cost me something I wasn't prepared to lose. And now? Now I have watched you stand beside me in front of an entire territory, she said, and not once flinch. I think the cost, whatever it might have been, is worth it after all. Weeks passed. The territorial investigation moved forward, exactly as Inspector Pruitt had promised. Rourke's position revoked, his forged filings voided, and the boundary restored to its rightful line, the whole tangled scheme unraveling slow, but steady the way honest paperwork eventually unravels dishonest paperwork, when enough patient people insist on the unraveling. Rourke himself avoided prison, in the end, though it was close. His testimony against Draven counted for something in his favor, Pruitt argued, and a judge in the territorial capital agreed, sentencing him instead to the loss of his position, a heavy fine he'd spend years paying off, and a formal bar from ever holding public office in the territory again. Roan attended the sentencing, more out of a need to see the whole matter through to its proper end, than out of any particular desire to watch a broken man receive his due. Rourke looked smaller in the territorial courtroom than he had in that back room, with the match still smoking on the floor, smaller still than he had standing beside Draven at the gathering. When the judge finished reading the sentence, Rourke turned, briefly, and found Roan's eyes across the room. I am sorry, he said, quiet enough that only those close by could hear it. For the wolves. For all of it. I don't expect that to mean much. Coming this late. It means something, Roan said. Not everything. But something. It was, he thought afterward, about as honest an answer as he had in him to give. He felt no particular satisfaction hearing the sentence read, and no particular anger either. Just a kind of tired relief that the whole business had a proper ending instead of simply fading unresolved into rumor, the way so many things out here tended to. Draven left the territory before the investigation concluded. Word reached them eventually, secondhand, that he'd resurfaced somewhere further east, already, according to rumor, testing the same tired methods against some other unsuspecting county. Roan felt something grim about that news, some frustration that a man like that simply moved on to fresh ground instead of facing a fuller reckoning. But Talise, when he mentioned it, only shook her head, slow. Word travels, she said, faster than it used to, now that men like Pruitt and Whitfield know his name and know to watch for it. He will find fewer soft places to land than he expects. That is its own kind of justice, even if it isn't the loud kind. Otis Corwin brought back the chain he'd borrowed, months late, though nobody mentioned the lateness. He stood in the yard with his hat in both hands. Wanted to say I'm grateful, he said, for how this all landed. Could have gone worse for me, given what I did. Appreciate that it didn't. Everybody deserves a chance to set something right, Roan said. You took yours. That's what matters going forward. Otis nodded, something like relief loosening his shoulders, and rode home without further ceremony. And that, Roan understood, was the particular quiet way most things out here eventually got settled. Not with speeches, just with small, honest gestures offered plain and received the same way. Kola came to visit that same week, riding out with Tewan, moving slower than she once had but steady enough, her silver hair braided neat again the way it had been. The day Roan first found her in that canyon. She sat with Talise a long while in the garden, the two of them talking low in Apache while Roan worked nearby, catching only fragments he couldn't follow, though the tone of it warm, easy, occasionally punctuated by something that might have been laughter told him plenty regardless. Before she left, Kola found Roan at the gate, studied him a moment with the same patient, measuring look she'd worn that first terrible afternoon in the canyon, before he'd known her name, before any of this had begun. You were kind to me, she said, before you knew what any of it would cost you, before you knew whose life you were about to be bound to. She smiled, faint but real. I told you then you were kind, or you simply didn't yet know enough to be afraid. I think now it was neither. I think you were simply the kind of man who does the right thing first and works out the cost of it later. Turned out to be a fair trade, Roan said. It usually does, Kola said, for the ones willing to make it honestly. She patted his arm once, brief and warm, and let Tewan help her back onto her horse, and the two of them rode off toward the ridge, leaving Roan standing at the gate with the particular full feeling of a circle closing exactly where it had first opened. One evening, some weeks on from that gathering at the edge of the camp, Talise set down her mending and looked at Roan with the particular directness she still reserved for things that mattered most. You told me once that I get to choose, she said. Anything I wanted changed about how we live here, you said. You tell me, and we change it. I remember saying it. I have something. He set down his own work, gave her his full attention, because he'd learned by now that when Talise led with those words, what followed was worth every bit of it. I want to build a proper room, she said. Not a corner of the kitchen, not a shelf by the door. A room built for the work for the herbs, for treating people and animals properly, with good light and shelving, built the right height, and a door that closes when the work needs quiet. She held his gaze steady. People are already coming. Mara Jenkins 2 counties over, the Haslets families from the camp. It will only be more, not less, as word keeps traveling. I want a place built for that, instead of borrowing space from a kitchen that was never meant to hold it. Roan considered it. Not long, the answer had settled in him before she'd even finished asking. Where do you want it, he said. East side, facing the sunrise. A small private note came into her voice. My mother's tent always faced east. She said a healer should see the first light before anyone else in the house did. Said it made the work easier to bear. Somehow, starting the day already having seen something good. Then east side it is. You're not going to ask what it will cost. In materials. In time away from the cattle. I already told you I wasn't going to be the kind of man who makes you argue for what you want, Roan said. I meant that the first time I said it. Still mean it now. Something moved through her face, quiet and full. I am still learning what to do with a promise that gets kept without me having to check on it first. Take your time learning it, he said. I'm not going anywhere. They built it through the back half of that autumn, working most evenings after the regular chores were done. Kesto and Tewan riding out twice to help raise the frame and set the roof beams, the same technique Talise had used on the stable years. It felt like years now, though it had only been one before. The room took shape slow, the way anything worth keeping tends to, a proper door. Shelving built at the height she asked for, not the height a man might have guessed at on his own. A single east-facing window, small but placed exactly right, so that the first light of every morning fell straight across the workbench before it touched anything else in the house. The day they hung that window, Talise stood inside the empty room a long while, watching dust motes turn slow in the early light, saying nothing. Well, Roan said from the doorway, that's the spot you wanted. It is exactly the spot, she said. I did not know I was allowed to want, until you asked me plainly enough that I had to answer honestly. She turned to him, and there was something in her face he'd come to recognize over the past year. Not the guarded, measuring look from that first blanket-fallen morning, but something that had grown up alongside it, patient and unhurried the same way she was. Patient and unhurried about everything that mattered to her. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. The same 2 words she'd offered him that very first night on the trail, except they carried an entirely different weight now. Built up slow over a year of mornings and evenings and hard-won trust, the way most things worth having get built. Kesto visited twice that autumn, staying a few days each time. He and Roan developed a way of talking that was mostly practical. The chief teaching Roan how to read weather building in distant cloud shapes. Roan teaching the chief how to spot a dishonest supply merchant from 30 paces. Neither one ever mentioned the ceremony at dawn that had started all of it. Neither needed to. Tawan came more often than his father, usually alone. Usually with some practical excuse checking the boundary markers. Delivering word from the camp that fooled nobody and wasn't meant to. He'd taken, without much comment from either side, to helping Roan with the heavier ranch work whenever he visited, the 2 of them falling into an easy partnership that needed few words to function. "You'll make a rancher of yourself yet," Roan told him once, watching Tawan set a fence post with more care than the job strictly required. "I have no interest in being a rancher," Tawan said. "I have an interest in making certain my sister's husband doesn't run this place into the ground," through simple ignorance. But there was no edge in it anymore, hadn't been for months, and Roan had stopped waiting for one. The garden grew, through that whole season, and into the next, deep green rows against red earth, that had spent years being nothing at all before Talise arrived and decided otherwise. People came from a fair distance eventually, asking what she grew and how, whether she'd look at something ailing in their own herds or their own families. She answered in her careful, exact, never more words than necessary, always exactly the right ones. More of them now came straight to the new east-facing room, knocked at its proper door, and waited to be let in, rather than catching her at whatever corner of the kitchen she happened to be working in that day. She never said so directly, but Roan noticed the particular ease it seemed to settle into her, having a door of her own to open on her own terms. Spring came around again the way it always does, indifferent to everything a person has survived to reach it. The garden that had once been nothing but red stone and packed earth now ran in full green rows clear to the old fence line, feeding not just their own table but half the families who came asking quietly whether the healer might have something for you, a fever, a wound, a horse gone lame nobody else could fix. Roan stood at that same back window one morning, coffee in hand, and watched Talise kneeling in the dirt exactly the way he'd watched her that very first morning, a lifetime and a whole territory of trouble ago. Same unhurried precision, same quiet purpose in every motion. Except this time, when she felt him watching, she looked up, smiled, easy and unguarded, the kind of smile that had once taken her weeks to risk showing him at all. He thought of the blanket falling that first red morning at her father's camp, of every wrong question he'd carried since. What's wrong with her turned finally, fully, into the right one. There had never been anything wrong with her there. There had only ever been a world too small and too frightened to hold the whole of what she was. Out here, on this land, under this wide indifferent sky, she didn't have to fold herself down small anymore. Neither did he. This is a work of fiction inspired by frontier life in the American West of the 1880s. Character names, tribal customs, and events are invented for storytelling purposes and are not intended to represent any specific historical person, community, or documented tradition.